The mystery of Karna's origin, the child abandoned in the river, is a story that begins not with a war, but with a whisper, a divine secret, and the quiet lapping of water against a woven basket. It is a story of a fate set in motion by a moment of adolescent curiosity and divine power, a fate that would echo down through generations and culminate in one of the most tragic conflicts ever recorded in epic poetry. This child, born of the sun, was cast away in the cold current, his identity erased by the very mother who bore him, a desperate act to preserve a royal reputation while unknowingly sentencing her son to a life of profound struggle. We often look to these ancient narratives as mere myths, yet they preserve the very real and ancient anxieties of lineage, the crushing weight of societal expectation, and the profound question of whether destiny is forged by the gods or by the choices we make in shadow. Tonight, we drift back to that riverbank to witness the convergence of the celestial and the terrestrial, and to follow the journey of the infant who would become one of history's most compelling and heartbreaking heroes. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. Our narrative begins in the heart of the Vrishni kingdom, long before the great war of Kurukshetra would stain the plains near the Sarasvati River. Here lived a princess named Pritha, the daughter of King Shurasena, who was given in adoption to his childless cousin, King Kuntibhoja, and thus became known to history as Kunti. Her childhood was defined by piety and duty, and her service to the rishis and sages who visited her adoptive father's court was legendary in its diligence. It was this impeccable service that brought her to the attention of the sage Durvasa, a figure of immense power known throughout the textual traditions of ancient India for his wisdom, but also for his ferocious, demanding temper. For an entire year, Kunti attended to his needs with patience that bordered on the divine, anticipating his desires and enduring his famously short temper without complaint. Pleased beyond measure by her devotion, Durvasa, whose name itself meant ill-clothed and perhaps hinted at his ascetic, unpredictable nature, decided to grant her a significant boon. He possessed a series of potent mantras, sacred invocations drawn from the ancient Atharva Veda. He taught these to Kunti, explaining that by reciting any one of them, she could summon a specific deity, a deva, who would be compelled by the mantra's power to grant her a son who would share the god's own divine essence. After imparting this dangerous knowledge, the sage departed, leaving the young, unmarried princess in possession of a power she did not fully comprehend. Time passed, and Kunti, still a maiden, found her thoughts lingering on the mantras. A deep, youthful curiosity, mingled perhaps with a desire to test the truth of the sage's incredible gift, began to grow within her. One morning, standing on the balcony of the palace, she watched the sun rise, a magnificent, blazing disk of copper and gold climbing above the horizon. She thought of the god who piloted that celestial chariot, Surya, the illuminator, the witness to all deeds on earth. In that moment of impulsive curiosity, she chose him. She recited the mantra Durvasa had taught her, her gaze fixed on the rising sun, perhaps half expecting nothing to happen. But the ancient texts are clear. The power of a mantra given by such a sage is absolute. Surya descended from the heavens, his form radiant, his divine presence filling the chamber, his golden light almost too bright to behold. Kunti, terrified by the sudden reality of her actions, begged the god to depart, explaining she had merely been testing the mantra's power. But Surya, bound by the invocation, could not simply leave. He explained the nature of the boon. It was not a casual invitation, but a sacred summons that once issued must be fulfilled, or it would bring ruin upon the reciter and her family. He calmed her fears of social disgrace, assuring her that through his divine power, her virginity would be mystically restored after their union. Thus, in a union of the mortal and the divine, a child was conceived. The Mahabharata describes this birth as immediate. The child emerged not as a helpless infant, but as a being already touched by divinity. He was born adorned with a celestial coat of mail, the kavacha, which was physically part of his skin, and a set of divine earrings, the kundala, which shimmered with celestial light. This was the armor of the sun god himself, and it rendered the child, his son, virtually invulnerable. Kunta's brief moment of wonder turned to absolute dread. She held in her arms a divinely born son, yet she was an unmarried princess. The social codes of the Kuru and Vrishni lineages, which form the bedrock of the epic's world, were severe. A child born out of wedlock, a Kanyaputra, brought unpardonable shame upon a noble house, destroying the reputation of the mother and jeopardizing the political alliances of the father. Her future, her impending Svayamvara, the ceremony where she would choose her husband, and the honor of two royal families rested on her next decision. The text portrays her agony, a conflict between the sudden, powerful instinct of maternal love and the crushing, inescapable reality of her dharma as a princess. Her choice reflects the deep-seated anxieties about lineage and legitimacy that permeate the entire epic. A hero's identity was his lineage. Without a father's name, a warrior was nothing regardless of his skill. Kunti, fearing this social annihilation, resolved to abandon the child. She procured a waterproof box, or perhaps a simple wicker basket, lining it with soft silks. With a heart breaking, she placed the golden-armored infant inside, whispering prayers for his safety. She carried the basket to the banks of a river. Some traditions say the Ganges, others the river Ashva, a tributary of the Yamuna near Hastinapura. Under the cover of darkness, or the earliest light of dawn, she committed her secret to the current, watching the basket bob and weave, carrying her firstborn son away into an unknown future. This act of abandonment, born of fear and societal pressure, was the first link in a chain of tragedy. The river, a sacred entity in ancient India, became the child's first protector, a silent witness to the collision of divine will and human frailty, as the infant, who would be named Karna, began his journey, separated from the mother who would one day stand on the opposite side of a battlefield, begging for the lives of her other sons. As the woven basket continued its silent, winding journey, cradled by the river's current, the forces that had conspired to place it there returned to their celestial and terrestrial spheres. In the palace, a profound and terrible silence settled upon the Princess Kunti, who had just committed the defining act of her youth. As the sun god Surya had promised, Her maidenhood was miraculously restored, her body bearing no trace of the divine birth, leaving only the scar on her conscience as proof of what had transpired. This event, so central to the epic, invites us to pause and understand the immense powers Kunti had so impulsively invoked, for the god she summoned was no minor deity, but one of the most ancient and profound forces in the Vedic pantheon. Surya, the sun, is a figure whose origins stretch back to the very bedrock of Hindu textual tradition, the Rig Veda. In these ancient hymns, composed perhaps between 1500 and 1200 BCE, he is revered as the illuminator, the source of all life, light, and vision. He is the Loka Chakshu, the eye of the world, a divine witness who sees all actions, both public and secret. This attribute lends a biting irony to Kunti's story. She chose to summon the one god from whom no secret could ever be hidden, the very deity who would, by his nature, observe her subsequent act of concealment. In the Vedic schema, Surya is one of the Adityas, the sons of the primordial goddess Aditi, and is often celebrated as the divine charioteer who traverses the sky in a chariot pulled by 7 horses. These horses, a detail that persists into the epic age, have been interpreted by scholars as representing the 7 days of the week, the 7 colors of the spectrum, or the 7 chakras of yogic philosophy, symbolizing the sun's dominion over time and the body. By the late Vedic period, the era that forms the cultural and religious backdrop for the Mahabharata's composition, the nature of these gods had subtly shifted. The abstract, elemental forces of the Rig Veda were becoming more anthropomorphized, developing complex personalities, genealogies, and interactions with mortals. Surya was no longer just the abstract principle of light. He was a king, a father, a being who could be summoned and bound. This transition is crucial for understanding the story of Karna. The boon Kunti received from the sage Durvasa was not a simple prayer, but a piece of potent spiritual technology, a mantra drawn from the Atharva Veda. This specific Veda is textually distinct from the others. It contains not just hymns of praise, but also incantations, spells, and formulae for healing, protection, and sometimes for compelling supernatural outcomes. The power of Durvasa's boon lay in the ancient Indian philosophical concept of vak, or sacred speech. In this worldview, a mantra recited with perfect intonation and intent was not a request to a deity, but a verbal equation that compelled a result. The sound itself vibrated at a frequency that aligned with the god, forcing them to manifest and obey the invocation's terms. When Kunti spoke the words, she was not asking for Surya's attention. She was, in essence, wielding a divine law that the god himself could not defy. Surya's arrival was not an act of seduction, as later, more romantic interpretations might frame it. It was an act of cosmic obligation. His argument to Kunti, that the mantra must be fulfilled lest it destroy her, was a literal truth. The power she had unleashed, if left unconsummated, would have turned back on its wielder, a concept that underscores the immense danger mortals faced when trafficking in divine powers. This mechanism, the binding power of a boon or a curse, is the primary engine of fate in the Mahabharata. It is a world where words have weight, where oaths, once spoken, become as real and immutable as mountains. Durvasa's gift was a perfect, terrible example, a power that offered divine sons, but demanded an immediate, irreversible consequence. The birth of Karna, therefore, was not a biological event in the mortal sense, but a ritualistic one. The child was the physical manifestation of the mantra itself, a fusion of Kunti's mortal curiosity and Surya's celestial essence. This is why he was born not as a helpless, formless infant, but in a state of immediate, unnatural perfection. His armor, the kavacha, and his earrings, the kundala, were not accessories, but part of his very being, the tangible proof of his solar heritage. This armor, described as shining like the sun and impenetrable to any weapon, was Surya's divine protection, a father's gift to the son he was forced to conceive and instantly abandon. The entire episode serves a critical function in the architecture of the epic. It establishes the divine lineage of the story's central heroes, a common trope in epic traditions worldwide, from the Greek heroes sired by Olympians to the Mesopotamian kings who claimed divine descent. This divine blood was the narrative explanation for the heroes' ati minutiae, their superhuman abilities. But in the Mahabharata, it serves a darker, more complex purpose. It is the source of the story's deepest conflicts. Kunti's boon, which she would later use to bear the Pandava brothers, is the very thing that creates their deadliest and most tragic enemy. The secret she buried that morning would not stay buried. It was floating on the river, a living paradox of divine right and social shame, a boy born of the sun who was now drifting inexorably toward a life in shadow. The small, woven vessel, bearing its divine and secret cargo, continued its meandering passage, guided by the unseen hand of fate and the watchful distant gaze of the sun god. It bobbed past settlements and silent forests, a speck of human desperation on the vast, impersonal artery of the river. The Mahabharata compresses this aquatic journey, focusing not on the passage of time, but on the moment of discovery, the critical instant where destiny pivots. The basket, having traveled from the upper reaches of the Kunti kingdom, eventually drifted into the waters of the Ganges near the city of Champa, a vassal state under the dominion of the Kuru kingdom, whose capital, Hastinapura, lay upriver. It was here at the river's edge that the child's life in the shadows was exchanged for a life in a new, albeit humble, light. On the banks of the river, a man named Adiratha had come to perform his morning devotions. Adiratha was a man of note within the Kuru court. He was the Sutta, the chief charioteer to King Dhritarashtra, the blind monarch of Hastinapura. This position was one of deep trust and proximity to power, as the charioteer was the king's confidant, his protector in battle, and his guide in travel. Yet despite this professional standing, Adhiratha and his wife, Radha, carried a profound personal sadness. They were virtuous, kind, and deeply devoted to one another, but they remained childless, an ache that in the social and spiritual context of their time was seen as an unfulfilled dharma. As Adiratha waded into the sacred water, his prayers were interrupted by the sight of the basket, caught in the reeds near the bank, and the sound of a faint cry from within. He drew the basket ashore, his wife Radha joining him, and together they looked inside. The texts describe their profound astonishment. There lay an infant, not merely surviving, but thriving, his supernatural glow undimmed by his ordeal. His skin, a part of his very being, was the kavacha, the golden armor, and from his ears hung the kundala, the divine earrings, both shimmering with a soft, solar radiance. To the childless couple, this was no ordinary foundling. This was Daiva, a gift from the gods, a direct answer to their years of prayer. They saw not a problem of lineage, as Kunti had, but a solution to their deepest longing. With tears of gratitude, they lifted the infant, this impossible treasure delivered by the river, and resolved immediately to raise him as their own son. This moment of adoption is the single most important pivot in the entire epic, for in this act, the child was given an identity that would define, constrain, and ultimately doom him. Adiratha was a Suta, and his son would now be known as Sutaputra, the son of a charioteer. This social designation is critical, and it is a subject of immense scholarly and historical debate, revealing the complex, shifting nature of society in the epic age. The term Suta is profoundly ambiguous, existing in a liminal space within the ancient Indian social structure. In some textual traditions, particularly the later Dharmashastras, legal texts like the Manusmriti, c. 200 BCE, 200 CE, a Suta is defined as a Varna Sankara, or mixed caste. Specifically, it describes the offspring of a Kshatriya, warrior father, and a Brahmin priest mother. While this union was anuloma, with the grain, as the father was of a higher status than the mother in this specific schema, the resulting offspring did not belong to either parent's Varna, occupying a separate, specialized category. However, the word Suta held another, far more ancient and respected meaning. In the Puranas, ancient histories, the Sutas were the bards, the royal chroniclers, the storytellers who recited the epics themselves. Figures like Ugrashrava Sauti, who narrates the Mahabharata to the sages in the Naimisha forest, is a Suta. This role was one of great learning and ritual importance, far from a lowly station. The Mahabharata itself seems to exist in a world where both meanings are active, creating a tension that the narrative exploits. Adiratha is not a bard. He is an occupational Suta, a charioteer. This role, while requiring immense skill and proximity to the king, was firmly outside the Kshatriya class. The insult, Sutaputra, which will haunt Karna, is clearly not intended to mean son of a respected bard or son of a noble priestly union. It is used unequivocally to mean son of a servant, a man who holds the reins but does not wield the bow, a man who belongs to the service class, not the ruling class. This ambiguity reflects a society in transition, caught between the idealized fourfold Varna system, Brahmins, priests, Kshatriyas, warriors, Vaishyas, merchants, and Shudras, laborers, and a more complex granular reality of Jadis, birth groups, based on occupation and mixed lineage. The Mahabharata's world is not the neat, schematic diagram of the Manusmriti. It is a chaotic, vibrant, and often contradictory social landscape where status is constantly being negotiated, challenged, and brutally enforced. Adiratha and Radha took their new son home to the Suta quarter in Hastinapura. They named him Vasushena, the Lord of Wealth, or Born of Wealth, a name directly referencing the divine golden armor and earrings he possessed, the impossible riches he brought with him from the river. This name, given in love, defined him by his divine attributes. Yet the world would soon rename him, first as Radeya, the son of Radha, a matronymic that was itself unusual, and later as Karna, a name whose etymology is debated, perhaps the ear cutter for his earrings, or as some scholars have hypothesized, a subtle echoing linguistic trace of Kunti, the mother he never knew. He was raised in this loving, humble home, surrounded by the sights and sounds of the chariot stables, the scent of horses and oiled leather, the rhythmic clang of the smithy. He learned the dharma of a sutta from Adiratha, loyalty, service, and the intricate skills of managing a war chariot. But the blood of Surya and the samskaras, innate tendencies, of a kshatriya pulsed within him. This child was a living paradox, a solar prince being raised in the service corridors of the palace. His divine nature, his inherent svabhava, was on a collision course with the social identity, the karma, that his adoptive parents had given him. This fundamental conflict between his limitless, sun-born potential and the rigid, suffocating boundaries of his social station would be the furnace in which his formidable, contentious, and deeply tragic character was forged. In the bustling city of Hastinapura, the capital of the Kuru dynasty, the boy Vasushena grew under the loving care of Adiratha and Radha. He was, in every outward sense, a Sutaputra, a child of the charioteer caste, and his days were steeped in the rhythms of that life. He would have spent his early years in the royal stables, the air thick with the scent of hay, horses, and the metallic tang of the armory, learning from Adiratha the intricate and highly respected craft of charioteering. This was no simple trade. A warrior's charioteer was his lifeline, his strategist, and his guardian, needing to understand the chaos of a battlefield, the temperament of the horses, and the mind of the warrior he served. Adiratha, in his deep love for his divinely found son, would have patiently imparted this knowledge, seeing it as the boy's dharma, the sacred duty and social role he was born into by adoption. This was the path laid out for him, a life of service, of loyalty, of honor within the bounds of his varna. But the universe had played a profound trick on the rigid social structures of Hastinapura. The child Vasushena was a vessel for two conflicting truths. While his dharma, his prescribed societal duty, was that of a sutta, his svabhava, his innate, essential nature, was that of a kshatriya, a warrior of the highest order. This was the blood of Surya, the sun god, and it manifested as an undeniable gravitational pull towards the very skills his station forbade him from formally learning. From the railings of the practice grounds, he would have watched, his gaze fixed and intense, as the Kuru princes, the 100 sons of Dhritarashtra, the Kauravas, and the 5 sons of the late King Pandu, the Pandavas, received their education. They were drilled by masters at arms in the use of the mace, the spear, and the sword, but most of all in the celestial science of archery, Dhanurvidya. This art, in particular, called to Karna. It was as if the bowstring vibrated in harmony with his own soul. The Mahabharata suggests his talent was not merely learned but remembered, an intuitive blossoming of his divine inheritance. While Adiratha taught him to hold the reins, Karna's hands yearned to hold a bow. While his peers learned the songs of the bards, he memorized the flight of arrows. He began to practice in secret, perhaps with a simple bow fashioned in the woods, his focus absolute. The texts are clear that his skill was prodigious and almost entirely self-taught in these formative years. He did not just learn to shoot, he excelled, his innate understanding of the weapon baffling all who witnessed it. His solar heritage gave him an instinctive grasp of ballistics, of breath control, of the meditative focus required to make the arrow an extension of the will. This dissonance between his inner reality and his outer world is the central philosophical crisis of Karna's life, and it serves as the epic's most potent critique of its own social system. The Mahabharata is obsessed with the question of dharma. Is dharma an absolute, rigid set of rules dictated by one's birth, varna dharma? Or is it svadharma, the personal, individual duty that aligns with one's own innate qualities, guna, and actions, karma? Karna's very existence weaponizes this question. Society looked at him and saw a sutta, forbidding him from the kshatriya's knowledge. But Karna looked within himself and felt, with blazing certainty, the svabhava of a warrior. To follow his varna dharma would be to deny his very soul. To follow his svabhava would be to declare war on the entire social order. This internal conflict forged in him a complex psychology. On one hand, he felt a deep and abiding love for Adhiratha and Radha. They were the only parents he knew, the ones who had rescued and nurtured him. His loyalty to them was absolute, and a part of him would always identify as Radheya, the son of Radha, a name he bore with a mixture of pride and defiance. On the other hand, every time he saw the Kuru princes, every time he was reminded of his station, he felt the sting of injustice. He was their equal, perhaps their superior, in natural skill, yet he was relegated to the sidelines, an observer, not a participant. This duality created a simmering resentment, not towards his parents, but towards the system, and specifically towards the establishment that enforced it. His father, Adhiratha, must have watched this burgeoning talent with a mixture of awe and terror. He saw his son mastering skills that could bring him glory, but also skills that would invite ridicule, rejection, and potentially violent censure from the Kshatriya elite. The social boundaries of the epic age were not suggestions, they were fiercely policed. For a Sutaputra to aspire to the knowledge of a Brahmin or the power of a Kshatriya was a profound transgression. Yet Karna's drive was too strong to be contained. He could not, and would not, be merely a charioteer. His solar blood demanded otherwise. He began to seek knowledge wherever he could find it, piecing together the art of warfare from observation, from listening to the tales of soldiers, and from his own relentless private practice. His ambition was not just for skill, it was for validation. He didn't just want to be a warrior, he needed the world to call him one. This burning need for recognition, for his svabhava to be acknowledged by the world as his true dharma, became the animating force of his life. It was a hunger that would make him vulnerable to friendship from unexpected and dangerous quarters. It was a hunger that made him reckless in his pursuit of power, and it was this hunger that finally drove him from the shadows of self-training, pushing him to take the first great, catastrophic step in formally claiming his identity. He had reached the limit of what he could learn on his own. To become the archer he knew himself to be, he needed a guru. He set his sights on the greatest teacher in the Kuru kingdom, the man responsible for training the Pandavas and Kauravas, the royal preceptor Dronakarya. This decision, to step out of the Suta's stables and onto the Kshatriya's training ground, was his first formal challenge to the world, a challenge that would be met with the first of many devastating rejections. With the resonant twang of the bowstring echoing in his mind as a constant internal summons, Karna, now a young man, made the fateful decision to formally seek out the teacher of kings. His ambition, forged in the fires of innate talent and social exclusion, had become too vast to be satisfied by secret practice in the forests surrounding Hastinapura. He needed a true guru to unlock the final celestial measure of his abilities, and in the Kuru kingdom there was only one, Dronakarya. Drona was a figure of immense, almost contradictory prestige. He was a Brahmin by birth, a descendant of the sage Bharadwaja, a man who should have been dedicated to ritual and scripture. Yet through a complex series of life events, including poverty and a bitter rivalry, he had mastered Dhanurvidya, the science of warfare, to a degree unmatched by any living Kshatriya. He was now the Acharya, the royal preceptor, retained by Bhishma to instruct the Kaurava and Pandava princes, a position that placed him at the very nexus of Kuru military power. Karna, filled with a hope that was almost painful in its intensity, presented himself at Drona's Gurukula. This was not a public school, open to all. The ancient Gurukula was an intimate residential institution, an ashram where the guru was the absolute patriarch. Students, or shishyas, lived with their master, serving him and his family, tending his household and cattle, and in this act of service, proving their worthiness to receive the vidya, the knowledge. Entry was not based on tuition, but on the guru's acceptance, which was almost invariably predicated on lineage and suitability. It was an ecosystem of exclusivity, designed to preserve and transmit specialized, often sacred, knowledge down specific, pure bloodlines. Into this exclusive world walked Karna, the Sudaputra, his divine armor hidden beneath his clothes, his solar heritage invisible to all but the gods. He stood before Drona, a man who valued two things above all, pedigree and prodigious talent, especially talent that he could mold to serve his own complex agenda of vengeance against his rival, King Drupada. Karna, possessing talent in spades, made his humble request to be accepted as Drona's student, to learn the art of archery, and to be taught the secrets of the Divyastras, the celestial weapons. Here, the epic presents one of its most poignant and brutal moments of social enforcement. Drona, the master, looked upon the aspirant. He may have recognized the boy's svabhava, the blazing warrior spirit within, but the rules of his dharma as a royal preceptor were rigid. He looked at Karna's social standing, that of a charioteer's son, and in that instant, the Sudaputra identity eclipsed the divine potential. Drona refused him. The textual traditions vary on the exact words, but the sentiment is unanimous. Drona states that his Gurukula is for Kshatriyas and Brahmins only. He is employed to teach the princes of the Kuru line, to whom he has given his word. He cannot, or will not, dilute this sacred instruction by offering it to a member of the Suda caste. This rejection was not a quiet, private refusal. It was a public declaration of Karna's unworthiness, likely delivered in the presence of the very princes he sought to equal. It was a categorical denial, a slamming of the great door of the establishment in his face. It was the system telling him, in the clearest possible terms, "You are not one of us. Your innate nature is irrelevant. Your birth is your destiny." This rejection was about more than just social exclusion. It was about the gatekeeping of apocalyptic power. What Karna truly sought was not just to shoot arrows. He sought the Brahmastra. In the textual traditions of the epics and Puranas, the Brahmastra is the pinnacle of military knowledge, a weapon of unimaginable destructive force. It is not a physical object, but a mantra, an incantation that infuses a simple arrow or even a blade of grass with the very power of Brahma, the creator. Its use was said to be capable of annihilating entire landscapes, poisoning the earth for generations, and ending an entire yuga, an age of the world. This knowledge was, therefore, the most closely guarded secret in the epic's world. It was Brahma Jnana, divine knowledge, and it could only be imparted from a qualified guru to a shishya who had proven himself worthy, not just in skill, but in moral character, emotional stability, and, critically, in varna. The gurus were the guardians, the fail-safe mechanisms, to ensure this power did not fall into the hands of those who might misuse it. Drona's refusal, seen in this light, was him upholding his sacred duty as a gatekeeper. To him, a Sutaputra, regardless of his talent, was not a qualified vessel for such knowledge, lacking the Kshatriya's ordained right to wield it. This moment, this agonizing rejection, became a core wound in Karna's soul. It was a humiliation that festered, hardening his resolve and deepening his resentment against Drona and his star pupil Arjuna, the one on whom Drona doted. The refusal did not extinguish Karna's ambition, it merely diverted it. It proved to him that the legitimate path was forever barred. If the orthodox establishment gurus like Drona would deny him based on his birth, he would seek knowledge from a source outside of orthodoxy, a teacher whose own history was one of rebellion against the very Kshatriya class Drona served. He turned his gaze south toward the legends of a renegade Brahmin, an axe-wielding avatar of Vishnu, the great and terrible Parashurama. After the searing rejection from Dronakarya, Karna's path was irrevocably altered, his resolve hardening from a desire for inclusion into a relentless quest for vindication. He did not return to the stables. Instead, he traveled, seeking the only other master who could complete his education. The great, axe-wielding sage Parashurama, an avatar of Vishnu, whose defining characteristic was his militant hatred for the Kshatriya class. This, Karna reasoned, would make him the perfect teacher, but Parashurama had vowed to teach only Brahmins. So Karna, in an act of profound and tragic deception, presented himself not as a Sutaputra, which would have been rejected, nor as a Kshatriya, which would have invited death, but as a Brahmin eager to learn the arts of war. Under this falsehood, he was accepted, and for years he served his new guru with the same superhuman diligence Kunti had once shown Durvasa, mastering every facet of warfare and acquiring the knowledge of the most potent celestial weapons, including the Brahmastra itself. Armed with this apocalyptic knowledge, his innate solar power, now honed to a razor's edge by a master's training, Karna finally returned to the kingdom that had spurned him. He was no longer the hopeful boy begging for tutelage. He was a warrior without equal, waiting for the precise moment to announce his arrival to the world. That moment came on a day of great celebration in Hastinapura. Dronakarya, his education of the Kuru princes now complete, had organized a Rangabhumi, a public exhibition of arms, a graduation ceremony for his students to showcase their martial prowess before the royal family and the assembled citizenry. The city was alive with anticipation, its people thronging to a vast arena prepared for the tournament, a place of packed earth and royal pavilions shimmering with silks and banners. The city of Hastinapura itself, the stage for this drama, is not merely a location in a poem. It is a tangible place, a site that echoes with the whispers of a verifiable past. Archaeologists, Most notably Dr. B.B. Lal in the early 1950s, excavated the mound identified by tradition as the ancient Kuru capital, located in the fertile Doab between the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in modern-day Uttar Pradesh. What they unearthed, lying beneath layers of subsequent civilizations, was a distinct cultural stratum. They found fragments of a sophisticated and elegant pottery known as painted grayware, PGW. This fine, smooth, gray-toned ceramic, decorated with delicate geometric and floral patterns in black pigment, is a hallmark of the early Iron Age in northern India, dated by scholars to roughly 1100 to 800 BCE. This timeline aligns uncannily with the traditional dating of the epic's events. The people who used this painted gray ware lived in modest mud brick or wattle and daub houses, practiced agriculture, and were among the first in the region to utilize iron technology. When the Mahabharata speaks of Hastinapura, it is describing a city that was the center of this very real, very ancient PGW culture. The epic's grand palaces may be poetic embellishments, but the place, the Kuru kingdom, was real. Into this arena, seated in the royal stands, were the blind king Dhritarashtra, his queen Gandhari, the wise granduncle Bhishma, and the preceptors Drona and Kripa. And there, seated among the royal ladies, was Kunti, unaware that the son she had surrendered to the river was now a man, standing somewhere in the crowd, watching. The tournament began. The princes demonstrated their skills. Duryodhana and Bhima, the great rivals, showcased their brutal mastery of the mace. Yudhishthira, his precision with the spear. The twins Nakula and Sahadeva, their unmatched swordsmanship. But the day belonged to Drona's prize pupil, Arjuna. When Arjuna entered the arena, a wave of awe hushed the crowd. He moved with a grace that seemed supernatural, his focus absolute. He performed feats of archery that bordered on the magical, firing 5 arrows into the mouth of a revolving iron boar, striking a moving target while blindfolded, and summoning divyastras that conjured fire and water. The display was dazzling. Drona, his heart swelling with pride, stepped forward and, embracing his student, declared him the greatest archer on earth, a peerless warrior. It was in this exact, supercharged moment of acclamation, as the crowd roared Arjuna's name, that a sound split the air, louder and more resonant than any applause. It was the sharp, thunderous twang of a great bowstring, echoing from the main entrance of the Rangabhumi. A silence of pure shock fell over the arena. All eyes turned to the gateway, where a figure stood silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He walked forward into the light, and the collective breath of the assembly was stolen. He was tall, his presence radiating an almost painful charisma, and he was adorned with the divine gifts of his father. The golden kavacha pulsed on his chest like a second heart, and the kundala in his ears captured the sunlight, framing his face in an unearthly golden halo. It was Vasushena, the son of Adiratha, but on this day he would be reborn as Karna. He strode to the center of the arena, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on Arjuna. With a voice that carried to every corner of the stadium, he addressed Drona, his words polite but laced with iron. "Acharya," he announced, "you have declared your student peerless, but I am here, and I can perform every feat he has shown, and I can perform them better." The audacity of the challenge was stunning. This was not merely a rival. This was a complete unknown, an uninvited stranger challenging the star pupil of the Kuru house in front of the entire kingdom. Kripacharya, the other royal guru, stepped forward, his duty to protocol overriding his astonishment. "Warrior," he demanded, "this is a royal tournament. Prince Arjuna is of the Kuru dynasty, son of Pandu and Kunti. To challenge him, you must be his equal. Announce your lineage. Name your father, your mother, and the royal house to which you belong." This was the question, the one inescapable barrier. Karna, who had just commanded the arena with his divine presence, now stood frozen. The blazing confidence on his face faltered, replaced by a flush of deep, agonizing shame. He, who had mastered the Brahmastra, who wore the armor of the sun, was trapped. He could not name his father, for Adiratha was a Sutta. He could not name his mother, for he did not know her. He stood silent, his head bowed. From the stands, the Pandavas, led by Bhima, began to laugh. "A Sutta Putra," Bhima roared, his voice dripping with contempt. "A charioteer's son. He has no more place in this arena than a dog in a sacred ritual. Here, boy," he taunted, "take up the whip and the reins. Those are the tools of your caste, not the bow." The public humiliation was absolute. Karna stood, paralyzed by his birth, as the setting sun cast a long, cold shadow over the arena, mirroring the shadow that had just fallen over his soul. As Karna stood immobile, the laughter of the Pandavas and the jeers of the crowd washing over him, the bright promise of the morning curdling into the deepest shame of his life, a new figure stepped forward from the royal enclosure. It was Duryodhana, the eldest of the 100 Kaurava brothers, his face not set in mockery, but alight with a fierce, calculating admiration. He had watched the entire exchange, not with the contempt of his cousins, but with the keen eye of a political and military strategist. Where Drona saw a breach of protocol and Bhima saw a social inferior, Duryodhana saw something far more valuable, a warrior of blinding divine-level talent, a man who, in that one thunderous bow shot, had shown the power to rival and perhaps even eclipse Arjuna. For Duryodhana, whose entire existence was defined by his jealous, all-consuming rivalry with his Pandava cousins, this was not a problem. This was a gift from the gods. Striding into the center of the arena, his heavy mace resting on his shoulder, Duryodhana raised his hand, and his voice, a low, powerful rumble, silenced the arena. The Shastra, scripture, proclaims 3 types of men who may be called king, he declared, his words aimed directly at Kripacharya and the Pandavas. One who is born of a royal bloodline, one who is a hero, and one who leads an army. If this warrior is not permitted to challenge Arjuna because he is not a king, he paused, letting the implication hang in the air, then I shall make him one, now. This was an act of astonishing political theater and genuine impulsive magnanimity. Duryodhana, acting with the full authority of the Kuru crown prince, was about to unilaterally redraw the map of power in the arena. He turned to his attendants, his voice ringing with command. "Bring the sacred water, the throne, and the crown." "This man," he said, placing a heavy, possessive hand on Karna's shoulder, "is a hero. His bearing, his power, and his divine armor speak of a lineage greater than any of us know. He is fit to rule. I, Duryodhana, son of Dhritarashtra, do hereby consecrate him as the Raja of Anga." A murmur of pure shock rippled through the assembly. Anga was not some fictional, symbolic title. It was a real, known, and powerful kingdom, one of the 16 Mahajanapadas, the great realms of ancient India, a region whose existence is well attested in historical and religious texts, including the Atharva Veda and early Buddhist and Jain scriptures. Located to the east of the Kuru kingdom, encompassing parts of modern-day Bihar and West Bengal, Anga was known for its wealth, its trade routes along the Ganges, and its capital city, Champa, coincidentally, the very city near which Adiratha had found the infant Karna in his basket. This was not a hollow gesture. In the political geography of the epic, the Kuru kingdom, centered at Hastinapura, was the Samrat, the emperor, and kingdoms like Anga were vassal states or subsidiary kingdoms. They were semi-autonomous, ruled by their own rajas who, in turn, owed dharma, duty, tribute, taxes, and military aid to the Kuru overlord. Duryodhana was, in effect, using his executive authority to install a new governor, a new client king, whose first and primary loyalty would be to him. Priests were hastily summoned. A ceremonial throne was placed on the blood-red earth of the arena. Karna, still reeling from the whiplash of public humiliation to sudden, unthinkable honor, was seated. Brahmins began chanting the mantras of Abhisheka, the sacred consecration, sprinkling him with water from the Ganges. Duryodhana himself placed a golden crown upon Karna's head, just above the shimmering kundala. In that moment, everything changed. Karna was no longer Vasushena, the Sutaputra. He was Raja Karna, king of Anga, a consecrated kshatriya by royal decree. He now possessed the one thing he had been denied: a name, a lineage, and a title. He was, by every social and political definition, Arjuna's equal. He stood up, the crown secure on his head, and turned to Duryodhana. His gratitude was so immense, so profound, that it transcended words. He grasped Duryodhana's hands and swore an oath of eternal friendship and unbreakable loyalty. "You have given me what no guru and no god would," he pledged. "You have given me my name. From this day, my arm, my bow, and my life are yours to command." This was the birth of the Mahabharata's most significant and tragic alliance. Karna was now bound by Enam, the sacred, inescapable debt of gratitude to the one man who had seen his worth. This bond would become his new dharma, one that would, in time, force him to make terrible choices, pitting his loyalty to Duryodhana against the very dharma of the cosmos. As the sun began to set, casting the entire arena in a deep, dramatic crimson, the challenge was reissued. But before Arjuna could respond, a new commotion interrupted the proceedings. From the crowd, an old man, weeping with joy and confusion, stumbled forward. It was Adiratha, the charioteer, his clothes humble, his hands trembling. He had seen his son humiliated and then impossibly crowned. Karna, seeing his adoptive father, did not hesitate. In full view of the court, the newly crowned king of Anga stripped off his royal cloak, left his throne, and prostrated himself, touching his crowned head to the dusty feet of the Suta. This act of pure, filial devotion sent a fresh shockwave through the crowd. Bhima, ever scornful, roared with laughter again. "See, he truly is a Sutaputra, a king bowing to a charioteer. The world is upside down." But Duryodhana did not flinch. He recognized the honor in the act. And in the royal pavilion, a woman watched this entire scene, the crowning, the challenge, and the bow to Adiratha, with a dawning, sickening horror. Kunti, seeing the divine armor and earrings, seeing the unmistakable solar radiance she herself had birthed, recognized the man who had just challenged her other son, Arjuna. She recognized her firstborn, the child she had abandoned to the river. The realization was too much. She swayed, her vision blurred, and she fainted dead away. Her terrible secret, now a living, breathing, crowned king, allied with her family's greatest enemy. The crowning of Karna as king of Anga, a moment of profound political theater orchestrated by Duryodhana, had solidified the alliances that would define the coming age. Karna, now possessed of a name and a kingdom, stood as a pillar of the Kaurava faction, his loyalty to Duryodhana forged in the fire of public gratitude. But this royal status, this sudden elevation, was built upon a power that had been acquired through an equally profound deception, a deception that had taken him far from Hastinapura to the remote, windswept slopes of the Mahendra mountain range. It is to that period of his life we must now turn to understand the true source of the knowledge that had so terrified the Rangabhumi and the nature of the master who had bestowed it. This teacher was Parashurama, a figure who is perhaps one of the most complex, anachronistic, and textually fascinating in the entire Sanskrit epic tradition. To understand Parashurama, one must first understand that he is not a simple mortal. He is Bhargava Rama, or Rama with the axe, the sixth avatara, incarnation of the god Vishnu, descended to earth to restore dharma. His dharma, however, was not one of peace, but of violent restoration. Born a Brahmin of the Bhrigu clan, his defining story is one of righteous fury. After a tyrannical Kshatriya king, Kartavirya Arjuna, stole his father's sacred wish-granting cow, Parashurama embarked on a terrible vow. He would cleanse the earth of the Kshatriya, warrior class. The texts claim he did this 21 times, filling 5 great lakes with their blood. His entire identity was thus one of militant Brahmanism, a walking, breathing paradox who used the Kshatriya's own arts of war to destroy them for their adharma, unrighteousness. Here we encounter the historiographic mystery that the outline bullet references Parashurama's strange chronology. He is a Chiranjeevi, one of the 7 immortals, destined to live until the end of the Kalpa, the cosmic age. This textual device allows him to appear in narratives separated by vast gulfs of time. He is a major figure in the Ramayana, which is set in the Treta Yuga, where he famously confronts the 7th avatar, Rama of Ayodhya. Yet he is also a central teacher in the Mahabharata, which takes place in the subsequent Dvapara Yuga, tens of thousands of years later. Scholars of textual criticism see this as a clear sign of layered composition and editorial redaction. Parashurama likely represents an older, militant, heroic tradition, possibly a non-Vedic or Bhrigu clan-specific epic, who was later, brilliantly, woven into the larger Puranic and epic framework. He became a narrative bridge, a way for the composers of the Mahabharata to connect their story to the older Ramayana cycle and to absorb the legends of the Bhrigu clan into the mainstream Vaishnava tradition. He is, in essence, a living fossil within the poem, a representative of an earlier, more brutal age. This was the master Karna sought. After Drona's rejection, Karna, in his desperation, saw the perfect opportunity. Parashurama hated Kshatriyas. Drona served them. Parashurama was a renegade. Drona was the establishment. And most importantly, Parashurama had vowed to teach his ultimate weapon, the Brahmastra, only to a Brahmin. So Karna, the Sutaputra with Kshatriya blood, approached the axe-wielding sage on Mahendra Mountain and declared himself a Brahmin. This lie was the key that unlocked the door. Parashurama, seeing the boy's ascetic discipline, his unwavering focus, and his seemingly genuine desire to learn, accepted him. The tutelage that followed was unlike the courtly training at Hastinapura. This was not a gurukula of princes. It was the ashram of a warrior hermit. The training was relentless, brutal, and steeped in a kind of sacred fury. Karna, driven by his consuming ambition, proved to be the perfect student. His diligence was absolute. He served his guru with the devotion Kunti had once shown Durvasa, enduring pain, hunger, and exhaustion without a single complaint. His svabhava, his solar nature, absorbed the knowledge of warfare as dry earth absorbs water. Parashurama taught him everything. He taught him the physical arts, mastering every form of hand-to-hand combat and conventional weaponry. But then he bestowed the divine knowledge, the mantras for the divyastras, the celestial weapons, and finally, the two most devastating weapons in his arsenal. The first was the Bhargavastra, Parashurama's personal weapon, an ethereal volley of arrows capable of destroying an entire Akshauhini, a battlefield division of over 200,000 soldiers, in a single stroke. The second, and most coveted, was the Brahmastra itself, the weapon of the Creator, the ultimate deterrent. To bestow the Brahmastra was an act of profound trust. It was not just teaching a mantra. It was imparting the secret of both its invocation and, just as critically, its recall. The guru had to be certain that the shishya had the moral fortitude, the tapasya, not to use it in anger or for trivial gain. Parashurama, believing Karna to be a Brahmin who had conquered his passions, judged him worthy. For years Karna lived this lie, his identity a fragile construct held together by his aged will. He had become, under Parashurama's tutelage, arguably the most accomplished archer on earth, his only rival being Drona's student Arjuna, who was simultaneously learning his own set of divine weapons from the gods. Karna had acquired the power he craved. He had the knowledge to humble Drona, to defeat Arjuna, and to claim the title of greatest that he so desperately needed. But his entire education was founded on a deception, a crack in the very foundation of his dharma. And in the world of the Mahabharata, a world where oaths and truths are absolute, binding forces, such a lie, told to such a master, could not remain hidden forever. A day of reckoning was approaching, a day when his guru's trust would be tested and the weight of his falsehood would come crashing down upon him in the form of a terrible, inescapable curse. Karna's life under Parashurama had settled into a rhythm of profound, ascetic devotion, far from the intrigues of the Kuru court. On the serene, wind-swept plateau of the Mahendra Mountain, he had become the son Parashurama never had, and Parashurama, the father figure Karna had always craved, a master who saw only his limitless skill, not his disputed lineage. The deception upon which this relationship was built had faded into the background, buried beneath years of shared discipline and genuine mutual respect. Karna had achieved his goal. He was a master of the Brahmastra, a warrior whose knowledge of celestial warfare was complete. But the cosmic laws of dharma, which his lie had so profoundly violated, were not so easily forgotten. The Mahabharata as a narrative, is a relentless machine of cause and effect, and the bill for Karna's deception was about to come due. The incident that shattered this hard-won peace was like many of the epic's pivotal moments, deceptively simple, a quiet afternoon that would change the course of history. Parashurama, the aged warrior sage, felt weary after a long session of instruction. He sought to rest, and in a gesture of ultimate trust and paternal affection, he laid his head upon the lap of his most beloved Shishya, Karna, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Karna sat immobile, his heart swelling with pride at this display of his guru's favor, his posture a perfect statue of filial piety. He watched the clouds drift over the mountain peaks, his duty to ensure his master's comfort his only thought. Then a creature, a harbinger of his fate, appeared. The texts describe it as a Vajrakita, a thunderbolt insect or diamond insect, a monstrous, stinging beetle with a formidable power. Some traditions hold that this was no random creature, but a disguised agent of the god Indra, the divine father of his rival Arjuna, sent specifically to test the limits of Karna's identity. The insect crawled onto Karna's exposed thigh, and with a viciousness born of supernatural intent, began to bore into his flesh. It was not a simple sting, but a drilling, agonizing pain, as if a hot coal were being twisted into his muscle and bone. Blood began to flow immediately, a warm, dark stream that pooled in his lap. Karna's dilemma was absolute. His every instinct screamed at him to recoil, to swat the creature away, to cry out in agony. But his dharma as a Shishya was equally absolute. He must not, under any circumstances, disturb his guru's sleep. To do so would be the gravest disrespect. And so, caught between unbearable physical torment and his sacred duty, Karna made his choice. He remained perfectly, impossibly still. He did not flinch. He did not stiffen. He did not even allow his breathing to hitch. He mastered the pain, channeling all his tapasya, ascetic power, into the act of stillness, offering his own body as a sacrifice to his guru's comfort. He simply endured, a silent mountain of resolve, as the insect burrowed deeper and the blood flowed freely, soaking his robes and beginning to pool on the ground beneath him. The ruse held for a long time, a testament to Karna's superhuman endurance. But eventually, Parashurama was roused, not by a sound or a movement, but by the disquieting sensation of warmth and wetness. He stirred, his hand brushing against the spreading pool of blood, and awoke with a start. His eyes snapped open, and he beheld a sight that filled him with immediate, dawning horror. He saw the ghastly bleeding wound on his student's thigh, the dead insect lying nearby, and he saw Karna's face, pale and sweat-streaked, but still set in a mask of perfect, apologetic calm. Parashurama's mind, the mind of a Brahmin and a warrior, processed the scene in an instant. He was not moved by the devotion. He was incensed by the implication. He sprang to his feet, his voice, which had for years been that of a loving teacher, now thundering with the rage that had once cleansed the earth of Kshatriyas. "You have deceived me," he roared. Karna, terrified, began to stammer, to explain that he had not wanted to disturb his master. But Parashurama cut him off. "This," he bellowed, pointing to the grievous wound, "this endurance is not the dharma of a Brahmin. A Brahmin's body, his svabhava, is not built for this. He would have cried out, he would have flinched, he would have collapsed. Only a Kshatriya, with his innate warrior's fortitude, could possibly withstand such agony in silence. You are no Brahmin. Tell me the truth, or you will die where you stand. Trapped, his lie finally and irrevocably exposed, Karna fell to his guru's feet. The entire agonizing story poured out of him. His discovery by Adiratha, his Sutaputra upbringing, the humiliation at the Rangabhumi, Drona's rejection, and the desperate lie he had told to gain the knowledge he so craved. He begged for forgiveness, pleading that his devotion and service had been real, even if his identity was a falsehood. But Parashurama was beyond placation. His sense of betrayal was absolute. He, Bhargava Rama, the sworn enemy of the Kshatriya class, had been tricked. He had spent years arming a Kshatriya. Worse, one of unknown lineage but with all the warrior traits, with the most devastating weapons ever conceived. He had given the Brahmastra to the very class he had vowed to destroy. The punishment was swift, terrible, and poetically precise. Parashurama did not, perhaps could not, take back the knowledge Karna had already mastered, but he could render it useless. You have learned from me through deception, he pronounced, his voice now cold with the finality of a shrap, curse. And so, this knowledge, gained through a lie, will fail you when you need it most. When the day of your final, fated battle arrives, when you face your greatest enemy and your life hangs in the balance, you will find your mind empty. At the very moment you summon the mantra for the Brahmastra, you will forget it. This was the first great, inescapable lock of Karna's fate. It was not a curse of death, but a curse of failure at the most critical juncture. The very power he had sacrificed his integrity to obtain was now guaranteed to abandon him. He was cast out from the ashram, dismissed by his master, his education complete, but his future now indelibly stained by this prophecy of doom. He descended the Mahendra mountain, a warrior without peer, but also a man marked, a man who now knew that his greatest weapon was also his most profound source of dread. Descending from the Mahendra mountain, Karna was a changed man, his soul now carrying the invisible weight of his guru's curse. The knowledge he had sacrificed everything to obtain was now a poisoned chalice, a power that would abandon him in his darkest hour. He was, in effect, a warrior who knew the precise architecture of his own future failure. This knowledge did not, however, lead him to abandon his path. Instead, it infused him with a kind of fatalistic intensity, a drive to prove himself before that final, prophesied moment of doom. He wandered the kingdoms, his divine armor and earrings a silent testament to his solar heritage, his bow, his only true companion. He was a king without a kingdom to rule, as Duryodhana's gift of Anga was more of a title than a territory he yet inhabited, and a warrior with no war to fight. His days were spent in relentless practice, honing his Dhanurvidya to a level of perfection that seemed to defy human limits. He pushed himself to the very edge of his abilities, perhaps in the desperate, subconscious hope that skill alone could somehow cheat the fate Parashurama had decreed. He was a master of Shabdavedi, the art of sound piercing, the ability to strike a target based on sound alone, without sight. This was a skill that required a stillness of mind, a oneness with the environment that bordered on the mystical. It was this very skill, this pinnacle of his martial prowess, that would lead him directly into his second, catastrophic encounter with Dharma. One afternoon, While journeying through a forested region, Karna was deep in his practice. He was lost in the meditative rhythm of his art, the drawing of the string, the stillness of his breath, the silent hum of the world around him. Suddenly, his hyper-aware senses picked up a sound from the dense undergrowth, a rustling, a soft, heavy movement. In that split second, his warrior's mind processed the sound not as a peaceful, domestic noise, but as a threat. He perceived it as a large, wild animal, perhaps a tiger or a formidable boar, stalking him or a nearby village. His training, honed by Parashurama to be instinctive and lethal, took over. Without a moment's hesitation to neutralize the perceived danger, he drew his bow, aimed his arrow at the source of the sound, and released. The arrow flew true, a perfect Shabdavedi shot. It was followed not by the roar of a predator, but by the agonized, heartbreaking bellow of a cow. A cold dread, sharper than any physical pain he had ever known, seized Karna. He ran through the trees and emerged into a clearing to find his arrow buried deep in the flank of a dying milk cow. Standing over the animal, his face a mask of disbelief and utter desolation, was a Brahmin. The man was weeping, stroking the cow's head as its life ebbed away. This was not just any animal. It was his sacred cow, his companion, and his sole source of sustenance, the provider of the milk and ghee, clarified butter, he needed for his daily Agnihotra, the sacred fire rituals. In the philosophical landscape of ancient India, this was not a simple accident. It was a sin of profound magnitude. The concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence, was a cornerstone of religious thought, a principle that was gaining immense traction during the epic period, particularly through the rising Shramana traditions like Jainism and Buddhism. For all, ahimsa was a virtue, but the Gohotra, the killing of a cow, was a singular and heinous crime, placed by the Dharmashastras, law texts, on par with the killing of a Brahmin himself. The cow was Agnya, one who must not be slain. It was the symbol of motherhood, of selfless giving, of the earth itself. For a Kshatriya like Karna, whose sworn dharma was to protect Brahmins and their property, to have slain one even by accident was an unforgivable inversion of the cosmic order. Karna, his hands still trembling, rushed to the Brahmin's side. He was overcome with genuine remorse, not the strategic regret of a man caught, but the deep, spiritual sickness of one who has violated his own core dharma. He prostrated himself, begging for forgiveness, explaining the accident. "I mistook her for a wild animal," he pleaded. "My arrow was an act of defense, not malice." He offered the Brahmin anything and everything he owned. "Reverend sir," he begged, "I will give you 1,000 cows to replace this one. I will give you wealth, a home, anything you desire, only please release me from this sin." But the Brahmin, in his grief, was inconsolable. His rage, the Brahmatejas, Brahminical fury, that was said to be more potent than any Kshatriya's weapon, was absolute. He looked at Karna, this mighty warrior whose carelessness had just destroyed his humble life, and he refused all compensation. "No wealth can replace her," the Brahmin wept. "She was my child. You, warrior, are arrogant. You move through this world with your bow, so lost in your own power that you cannot distinguish a harmless cow from a predator. Your dharma is to protect, and you have destroyed. You have taken from me what was helpless, and so you too shall be made helpless." The Brahmin gathered his kamandalu, water pot, and taking the sacred water in his hand, pronounced the second great curse of Karna's life. You have slain my innocent cow, who was as helpless as the earth itself. Therefore, in the final battle of your life, when you are at your most desperate, this very earth, Bhumi Devi, will have her revenge. In that moment, she will reach up and seize your chariot, the symbol of your power. Your wheel will sink deep into the mud, trapping you, rendering you as helpless and immobile as my cow was when your arrow struck her down. You may be a great archer, Sutaputra, but you will die on the ground, unarmed and in dishonor. This curse was, in its own way, even more terrifying than Parashurama's. The first curse attacked his divine knowledge, the Brahmastra. This second curse attacked his physical, terrestrial power, his mobility as a Rathi, chariot warrior. Fate was now weaving a perfect, inescapable net. When his memory failed him, his chariot would also fail him. The two curses converged, ensuring that at his fated moment, he would be stripped of his knowledge, stripped of his chariot, and left defenseless. Karna, the king of Anga, the student of Parashurama, the son of the sun, stood silently in the forest, his head bowed, accepting the Brahmin's terrible pronouncement as the just reward for his karma. He turned and walked away, a man doubly doomed, his path now leading him inexorably back to Hastinapura, to the friend who had given him a crown, and to the war that would fulfill both prophecies. The years following Karna's return from the forest, now doubly cursed by the Brahmin and his own guru, were a period of simmering, unresolved tension. He held the title of King of Anga, a status gifted to him by Duryodhana, and his friendship with the Kaurava prince deepened into an unbreakable bond, a loyalty founded on the bedrock of that first public act of acceptance. He was a constant, formidable presence at the court of Hastinapura, a shadow of immense power clinging to Duryodhana's side, his very existence a silent, perpetual challenge to the Pandavas, especially to Arjuna, whom he had never been allowed to formally contest. The curses, though heavy on his soul, were invisible to the world. What the court saw was only his divine armor, his blazing skill, and his fierce, unwavering allegiance to the man who had given him a name. This period of restless waiting, of a power held in abeyance, finally found its focus in a single, momentous event, the Svayamvara of Draupadi, the princess of Panchala. Draupadi was no ordinary princess. She was Yajnaseni, she who was born of the sacrificial fire, a woman created not by mortal birth, but manifested from a yajna, fire ritual, performed by her father, King Drupada. This ritual itself was an act of vengeance, a plea to the gods for a son who could kill Dronakarya, who was Drupada's sworn enemy, and a daughter who would be destined for the Pandavas. Her beauty was said to be unmatched, but it was her svabhava, her fiery, intelligent, and unyielding nature that defined her. Her Svayamvara, the self-choice ceremony where a princess chooses her husband, was the most anticipated political event of the age. Kings, princes, and warriors from every corner of Bharata, from Madra and Sindhu, from Kashi and Chedi, from Gandhara and Magadha, gathered at Drupada's capital, Kampilya. Among this sea of royal suitors were Duryodhana and the Kaurava contingent, and with them, as an allied king, came Karna. The Pandavas, believed by the world to have perished in a fire at Varanavata, a plot orchestrated by Duryodhana, were also present, but they were in disguise, living as poor Brahmins on alms, their true identities a closely guarded secret. They sat not in the royal enclosures, but in the humble seating reserved for the priestly class. The air in the great Svayamvara hall crackled with anticipation. King Drupada, who secretly hoped for Arjuna to win his daughter, had devised a test of archery so difficult it was considered impossible for any but the greatest. In the center of the hall stood a massive, impossibly heavy divine bow. Mounted high above, on a complex rotating mechanism, was a golden fish. Far below, on the ground, sat a shallow pan of water. The challenge was this: a suitor must lift and string the great bow, and then, looking only at the reflection of the fish in the water, he had to fire 5 arrows in succession, piercing the eye of the revolving target. One by one, the greatest kings of the age approached the bow. Sisupala, Jarasandha, Shalya, all of them mighty Kshatriyas, failed even to lift it, let alone string it. The royal enclosure was filled with the sounds of grunts, strained sinews, and the embarrassed silence of failure. The assembled royalty grew restless and angry. It was then that Karna, the king of Anga, rose from his seat. A hush fell over the entire assembly. As he had done at the Rangabhumi, his very presence commanded the space. He walked to the center of the hall, the sunlight from the high windows catching his kavacha and kundala, making him appear as a terrestrial echo of his solar father. He approached the massive bow with a grace that belied the weapon's divine weight. He lifted it as if it were a reed, and in a single, fluid motion, he strung it. A resonant twang echoed through the hall, a sound of perfect, accomplished power. He had completed the first, impossible step. He picked up the 5 arrows, his gaze already calculating the complex geometry of the shot, his eye fixed on the rippling reflection in the pan of water. He was poised, a breath away from victory, a breath away from winning the most celebrated woman of his time, a prize that would have cemented his status as a Kshatriya king beyond all dispute. And in that precise, critical instant, a voice clear and imperious cut through the silence. It was Draupadi herself, standing up from her ceremonial seat. "Stop," she declared, her voice ringing with an authority that shocked the hall. "I will not wed a Sutta." The words struck Karna with the force of a physical blow. It was the Rangabhumi all over again, but infinitely worse. This was not a guru enforcing a rule of lineage. This was a woman, his potential bride, rejecting him personally, publicly, and with utter disdain based on the one fact he could neither change nor escape. The bow, still gripped in his hand, trembled with his sudden silent rage. He looked up from the reflection, his gaze meeting hers, and in that moment, the epic seals his fate. He was, once again, the outsider, the man whose divine gifts and kingly titles were rendered meaningless by the perceived stain of his birth. With a short, bitter laugh, he unstrung the bow, dropped it to the ground, and stalked back to his seat, his face a mask of cold fury. This moment, this public rejection by Draupadi, is one of the most critical and textually debated turning points in the entire Mahabharata. The version just described, where Draupadi herself voices the rejection based on caste, is the one that resonates most widely in the cultural imagination and is supported by many prominent manuscripts. It is thematically devastating as it solidifies Karna's alienation and provides the deep, personal motive for his later venomous cruelty toward Draupadi during the dice game. However, scholars of the epic, particularly those who have worked on the Bhandarkar Institute's critical edition, an attempt to reconstruct the text's most ancient, core narrative, point to a fascinating historiographic mystery. In some of the oldest and most sober manuscript traditions, this scene unfolds differently. In these versions, Draupadi says nothing. Instead, Karna, like all the other Kshatriyas before him, fails the test. He strings the bow, but his arrow misses the mark, or he falters, unable to complete the shot. This textual dispute presents two entirely different tragedies. In the caste rejection version, Karna is a victim of social prejudice, a capable hero denied his prize by bigotry. In the failed shot version, he is simply a man, like all the others, who was not destined for Draupadi. His failure is one of skill or fate, not of birth. Most scholars lean toward the caste rejection narrative as being more integral to the epic's complex moral architecture, as it provides the necessary karma for Draupadi's future suffering and Karna's future rage. It cements his worldview. The world, and especially the Pandava-allied establishment, is inherently unjust. His only refuge, his only source of honor, is Duryodhana, the friend who had never once questioned his worth. As he sat seething, a young man in the guise of a Brahmin stepped forward, approached the bow, and in an act of impossible grace, strung it, aimed, and sent 5 arrows flying, piercing the eye of the fish in a perfect, thunderous succession. Arjuna, his rival, had won the day, setting the stage for the inevitable final confrontation. The victory of the disguised Arjuna at Draupadi's Svayamvara sent a shockwave through the assembled royalty, and for Karna, it was a moment of profound, clarifying bitterness. The man who had been declared his peerless rival at the Rangabhumi had succeeded where he, whether by prejudice or by fate, had been denied. The subsequent revelation that the 5 Brahmins were, in fact, the Pandava brothers, alive and well, and that Draupadi would, by a complex decree, become their shared wife, only deepened the schism. The Pandavas, now allied by marriage to the powerful Panchala kingdom, were no longer a fugitive rumor, but a formidable political and military reality. This forced the hand of the Kuru elders in Hastinapura. The kingdom was officially partitioned, a strained compromise to prevent an immediate civil war. The Pandavas were given the wild, inhospitable, and arid tract of land known as Kandavaprastha, a place of dense, snake-infested forests, traditionally seen as uninhabitable. But with the aid of their divine patrons, Arjuna's father Indra and their cousin Krishna, they cleared the forest, performing a massive controversial fire sacrifice, and in its place, they built a city. This was no ordinary settlement. It was Indraprastha, a city of Indra, a fortress and palace so magnificent, so magically constructed, that its splendor was said to rival the celestial cities of the gods. Here, Yudhishthira, the eldest Pandava, was consecrated as king, and his brothers embarked on their own Digvijaya, conquest of the quarters, subjugating kingdoms and gathering immense tribute. Their power culminated in the Rajasuya Yajna, the royal consecration sacrifice, a complex, year-long ritual that only a king who had achieved universal dominion could perform. To this grand sacrifice, all the kings of the world were invited, not as guests, but as tributaries. Duryodhana, the Kauravas, and their chief ally, Karna, were obligated to attend. For Duryodhana, the experience was not a celebration, but a week of pure, unadulterated torment. He walked through the halls of Indraprastha, his senses tricked by the magical architecture of the demon artisan Maya. He mistook solid, gem-studded floors for pools of water, hiking up his robes in embarrassment, only to then fall, fully clothed, into an actual shimmering pool he had mistaken for a crystal floor. The Mahabharata describes the Pandavas, their servants, and most cruelly Draupadi herself, erupting in laughter at his humiliating blunders, with Draupadi reportedly taunting, "The son of the blind is, it seems, also blind." This public humiliation, this mockery in the heart of his rival's impossible palace, ignited a fire of jealousy and hatred in Duryodhana that consumed all reason. He returned to Hastinapura, not just jealous but spiritually poisoned, his mind fixated on a single goal: ruin. He wanted not just to defeat the Pandavas, but to strip them of their wealth, their kingdom, their status, and most of all, their pride. It was this venomous desire that gave birth to the infamous game of dice. Duryodhana's maternal uncle, Shakuni, the king of Gandhara, was a master of the dice, though his skill was not one of chance, but of sorcery and deception. Together, they conceived a plan. They would challenge Yudhishthira, who was known to have a single catastrophic weakness: a love for the game of dice and a rigid inability to refuse a challenge to a friendly match. Karna's role in this conspiracy is a matter of profound ethical debate. He was not the architect of the plot. That was Shakuni, nor was he the primary beneficiary, which was Duryodhana. But he was its most powerful, silent, and morally complicit enabler. His loyalty to Duryodhana, the aranam or sacred debt he felt he owed for his crown, had now completely eclipsed his own independent judgment. He saw his friend consumed by a jealous rage, a rage Karna himself understood, having felt its sting at the Svayamvara. He did not counsel Duryodhana against this adharmic, unrighteous path. He did not warn him that a kingdom won through deceit, rather than conquest, was a kingdom cursed. Instead, he supported it. He used his voice in the Kuru court to advocate for the game, lending his gravitas as a king and a warrior to a cheap, rigged swindle. This was the first catastrophic moral failing of kingship that the game exposed. The Kuru elders, Bhishma, Drona, Vidura, all knew the game was a trap. They knew Shakuni's reputation, and they knew Yudhishthira's weakness. Yet they sat silent. Their own dharmic codes, their rigid adherence to the protocol that a king's friendly invitation cannot be refused, rendered them paralyzed. They placed the letter of the law above its spirit, and in their silence they became accomplices. The great hall of Hastinapura was prepared, the dice board laid out, a gleaming, polished surface that would soon become a sacrificial altar. Yudhishthira, bound by his Kshatriya oath, accepted the challenge, and the game began. At first, the stakes were small, but with every roll of Shakuni's enchanted dice, Yudhishthira lost. He lost his jewels, his treasury, his cattle, his army. The game became a fever, his addiction and his honor compelling him onward. He staked and lost his kingdom, Indraprastha itself. He staked his brothers, one by one, losing Nakula, Sahadeva, Bhima, and finally Arjuna, all of them now slaves to Duryodhana. He lost himself, becoming a slave. The hall was silent, a vortex of horror, as the Pandavas, masters of the world, were reduced to chattel, and through it all, Karna sat at Duryodhana's side, watching. This was not war, not the Kshatriya's righteous combat he had trained for. This was a slow, legalistic mugging, and he was, in effect, the lookout. When Yudhishthira had nothing left, Shakuni, with a predator's smile, offered one final unthinkable stake. "You still have one prize left, O king," he hissed. "You have your wife, Draupadi." In a moment of absolute dharmic collapse, his mind stripped of all reason, Yudhishthira agreed. He staked Draupadi. Shakuni rolled the dice, declared his victory, and the game was over. Duryodhana roared in triumph, a sound of guttural, poisoned relief. His vengeance was complete. He had not just won their kingdom, he had won them. He had won their wife. And it was here that Karna, silent until now, made his first active verbal contribution, a choice that would stain his karma forever. As the last, fatalistic roll of the dice settled, and Shakuni's cry of victory echoed in the stunned silence of the Kuru assembly, the game of dice was over, and the moral collapse of an age had truly begun. Yudhishthira stood stripped of his kingdom, his brothers, and himself. But it was the final, unthinkable stake, the loss of Draupadi, the queen of Indraprastha, that pushed the court into a realm of unprecedented adharma. Duryodhana, his body shaking with a triumphant, poisonous joy, his humiliation, in Indraprastha now lethally avenged, turned to his brother Dushasana. But Karna, his voice sharp and cold, interjected, his silence finally terribly broken. He was no longer a passive observer. He was in this moment an active participant, an enforcer of his friend's victory, and more darkly, an instrument of his own long-simmering vengeance. "Why do we wait?" Karna's voice cut across the hall. "The game is won. Go, Dushasana, and bring the slave Draupadi to this hall. Let her sweep the floors of the palace. She is our property now, to be used as we see fit." This was the moment his Aranam, his debt to Duryodhana, metastasized from loyalty into active cruelty. He who had been publicly shamed by Draupadi's words, "I will not wed a Sutta," was now the first to insist on her public, formal humiliation as a slave. Dushasana, Duryodhana's brutish and impulsive brother, needed no further encouragement. He stormed from the hall and burst into the queen's chambers. The Mahabharata paints a harrowing picture. Draupadi, in a state of ritual impurity, was clad in a single piece of cloth, her hair unbound. Dushasana, ignoring her pleas and her state, seized her by this unbound hair, an act of profound, symbolic dishonor to a Kshatriya woman, and began to drag her physically, forcibly, into the royal assembly. She was hauled like an animal through the corridors, stumbling, weeping, her cries for help echoing unanswered. She was brought before the silent, horrified court, a collection of the greatest heroes and wisest sages of the age: Bhishma, the grand uncle, the pillar of dharma; Drona, the royal guru; Kripa, and the king Dhritarashtra, who sat blind and silent, listening to his daughter-in-law's degradation. Draupadi, in her agony, did not just plead for mercy. She posed a question of staggering legal and philosophical weight, a question that cut to the very heart of dharma. "I ask this assembly," she cried, her voice ragged. "A husband, having first lost himself and become a slave, has he any right to stake his wife? Did Yudhishthira lose me before or after he lost himself?" This was the ultimate dharmic dilemma. If he lost himself first, he was a slave, and a slave, possessing no property, could not have legally staked her. If he lost her first, the stake was valid, but the act was monstrous. The entire hall was frozen. This was a question for the Dharma Shastris, for the elders, but they were silent. Bhishma, the wisest of them all, could only bow his head and murmur, "The ways of Dharma are subtle," his paralysis a testament to the court's complete moral failure. It was Karna who broke this stunned silence. His rage, perfected since the Svayamvara, was now given free rein. "Your question is pointless, Panchali," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. He stepped forward, his divine armor gleaming in the torchlight, his words a legalistic poison. "A wife, a son, and a slave. These three are declared to have no property. Whatever they earn belongs to he who owns them. Yudhishthira staked you, and he lost you. You are the property of King Duryodhana, won fairly. Your question is an impertinence." But he did not stop there. The personal, venomous motive, the scar from her rejection, now revealed itself. "Besides," he sneered, "a woman who consorts with 5 husbands is no better than a bandhaki, a harlot. To bring her here clothed or unclothed is no matter of surprise. She is not a wife, she is a slave, and a thing for our pleasure." This was Karna's cruelest, most unforgivable moment. He, a warrior, was not just insulting a woman. He was using a twisted legal argument to justify her sexual enslavement, dehumanizing her in front of the very men sworn to protect her. He was validating the adharma, giving it the stamp of his kingly and martial authority. Duryodhana, emboldened by his friend's venom, then gave the final, terrible order to Dushasana. "The Pandavas are our slaves, and she is our slave. Strip them of their royal robes. Strip her of her finery. Let us see what a slave looks to wear." Dushasana, laughing, first tore the upper garments from the Pandava brothers, who sat bound by Yudhishthira's oath, their heads bowed, their silent rage potent enough to burn the world. Then he turned to Draupadi. He seized the end of her single garment and began to pull. This was the Vastraharana, the disrobing, the absolute nodder of the Kuru court. It is a scene that scholars have debated for its profound social and ethical implications. Socially, it is the epic's most terrifying exploration of the status of women as chattel. Draupadi's brilliant legal question attempts to find a loophole in a system that defines her as property, but Karna's argument brutally slams that loophole shut, reinforcing the most patriarchal and misogynistic interpretation of the law. Ethically, the scene represents the total collapse of the Kshatriya code. The assembly hall, the Sabha, which was supposed to be a place of justice, dharma, had become a stage for its grotesque violation, orchestrated by the state itself. As Dushasana pulled and pulled, Draupadi, having found no protector among the silent heroes of earth, did the only thing left. She prayed. She raised her hands from her garment, abandoning her own attempt to protect her modesty, and surrendered to a higher power, her cries directed to Krishna. "O Govinda," she wept, "dweller of Dwaraka, savior of the afflicted, do you not see the shame being heaped upon me by the Kauravas?" And then the miracle occurred. As Dushasana pulled, the cloth did not end. He pulled and pulled, his arms growing weary, a pile of brightly colored silks rising on the floor of the court, but Draupadi remained clothed. Krishna from afar had answered, his divine power spinning an endless sari, a divine rebuke to the adharma of the court. The miracle, this divine intervention, was the proof of the court's failure. Dharma, having been abandoned by the Kuru elders, had been rescued by a god. Dushasana finally collapsed, exhausted, defeated by an infinite textile. At the same moment, terrible omens began to manifest. Jackals howled outside the palace, ill winds blew, and the sacred ritual fires flickered and died. The natural world itself was recoiling in horror at the act. This, finally, terrified the blind king Dhritarashtra, who, fearing the immediate, catastrophic consequences of this sin, broke his silence and offered Draupadi boons, a desperate act of damage control that would only temporarily delay the inevitable war Karna's cruel words had just helped guarantee. The terrifying omens and Draupadi's miraculous rescue by Krishna had shattered the adharmic spectacle in the Kuru court, forcing the blind king Dhritarashtra to relent. In a desperate bid to appease the divine forces his sons had provoked, he granted Draupadi boons, through which she wisely secured the freedom of her husbands and the return of their lost kingdom, Indraprastha. The Pandavas, their honor barely intact, were permitted to leave. But this reprieve was agonizingly brief. Duryodhana, seeing his meticulously planned vengeance undone in an instant, was consumed by a rage that bordered on madness. He, along with Shakuni and Karna, confronted his father, threatening suicide and ruin unless he was given one more chance. Dhritarashtra, in his fatal characteristic weakness, capitulated to his son's will and summoned the Pandavas back for one final, decisive game of dice. This second game was simpler, its stakes more terrible. It was a single roll, the winner to claim the kingdom, the loser to be cast into exile for 12 years in the forest, followed by a 13th year to be spent Ajnatavasa, in disguise, incognito. If they were discovered during that 13th year, the entire cycle of exile would begin anew. Shakuni, of course, rolled his enchanted dice, and Yudhishthira, bound by his catastrophic dharma to accept the challenge, lost. The Pandavas, along with Draupadi, were banished. As they put aside their royal silks and donned the simple, abrasive bark garments of ascetics, the court watched in silence. Karna, his face a mask of cold satisfaction, did not spare them a kind word. His loyalty was singular, and with the Pandavas' departure, his friend Duryodhana was now the undisputed master of the Kuru realm, the sole heir to both Hastinapura and the newly absorbed Indraprastha. With his rivals removed from the political map for 13 long years, Duryodhana's ambition swelled. He had the power, the wealth, and the land, but he lacked the one thing Yudhishthira had achieved, the ultimate imperial anointment. He was obsessed with the memory of the Rajasuya Yajna at Indraprastha, the ceremony that had declared Yudhishthira a Samrat, a universal emperor, the very event that had led to his own profound humiliation. Now, Duryodhana decided he would perform the Rajasuya. He would erase the memory of the Pandavas' glory by supplanting it with his own, a sacrifice of such magnificence that the world would forget Indraprastha ever existed. He consulted his Brahmins and priests, but they delivered a sobering verdict. The Rajasuya Yajna was a ritual of unique and dangerous power. As long as Yudhishthira, the previously consecrated Samrat, still lived, even in exile, Duryodhana was ineligible to perform it. It was a title that could not be shared. This was a bitter pill, but the priests offered an alternative, a sacrifice of almost equal prestige, the Vaishnava Yajna. This grand ritual would still establish his supremacy, but it required one critical prerequisite, the same one the Rajasuya demanded. To perform it, Duryodhana first had to prove his universal dominion. He had to compel every king in Bharata, the known world, to acknowledge his suzerainty, and crucially, to pay him tribute. This required a Digvijaya Yatra, a conquest of the quarters. It was a massive, sweeping military campaign where a king's champion would march to the north, south, east, and west, defeating all other monarchs in ritualized, or sometimes brutal, combat. Duryodhana, for all his bluster, was a mace fighter, not a general capable of such a continental campaign. His true strength lay in the loyalty he commanded. He turned to the one man he knew was capable, the one man whose martial prowess he believed eclipsed even Arjuna's. He turned to Karna. This was the moment Karna had been waiting for, not a rigged game of dice, but a true Kshatriya challenge, a chance to prove his dharma as a warrior and his Enam, debt, to his friend through glorious open warfare. He accepted the commission with a fierce joy. He would be Duryodhana's champion. He would conquer the world in his name. The Mahabharata's Karna Digvijaya Parva describes this campaign as a veritable hurricane of conquest, a testament to the full, terrifying power of the warrior who had been trained by Parashurama. Taking command of the Kuru army, Karna marched from Hastinapura, his divine armor blazing at the head of his chariot. He did not move with the slow, diplomatic caution of Yudhishthira's brothers. He moved with the speed and lethality of a predator. He stormed through the kingdoms of the east, subjugating the Angas, his own nominal kingdom, the Vangas, and the Kalingas. He moved north, shattering the armies of the mountainous tribes, the Kambojas and the Kiratas, societies whose existence is noted in other historical texts, like the Edicts of Ashoka, placing them in the Himalayan foothills and beyond. His campaign was relentless. He defeated Drupada, the father of Draupadi, forcing his old enemy to pay tribute to Duryodhana. He marched south, conquering the kingdoms of the Dravida lands. The text describes a world bowing before his singular might. Wherever he went, kings, stunned by his solar radiance and the speed of his divyastras, either surrendered, offering tribute, or were annihilated. He was fulfilling the epic's concept of a Chakravartin, the wheel-turning universal emperor, the ideal king whose chariot could roll unimpeded across the entire earth. But Karna was doing it not for himself, but for another. He was the arm, and Duryodhana was the head. After months, perhaps years, of this unstoppable campaign, Karna returned to Hastinapura. He did not return as a conqueror, claiming his own spoils, but as a loyal vassal. He entered the court not in triumph, but in humility, laying at Duryodhana's feet an unimaginable mountain of tribute, gold, gems, silks, horses, elephants, and most importantly, the sworn fealty of every king he had defeated. He had, through the sheer force of his svabhava as a warrior, made his friend the master of the world. Duryodhana, overcome with gratitude, embraced him, their bond now sealed not just by a gifted crown, but by a conquered world. With this tribute, the Vaishnava Yajna was performed, a spectacle of wealth and power that in Duryodhana's mind finally eclipsed the memory of Indraprastha. But this conquest, while establishing Karna's prowess beyond all doubt, had also hardened the divisions of the world, drawing clear, sharp battle lines. The kings who had been defeated by Karna would not forget him, and when the Pandavas' exile finally ended, those allegiances, forged in fear and tribute, would be tested on the bloody fields of Kurukshetra. Karna's Digvijaya Yatra had successfully consolidated the Kuru Empire under Duryodhana, transforming Hastinapura into the undisputed center of a vast tributary network, and the Vaishnava Yajna had been a spectacle of imperial grandeur. Yet this entire edifice of power was built upon a ticking clock. In the deep forests of Kamyaka and Dwaita, the 13-year exile of the Pandavas was drawing to its inevitable close. As the 12th year faded and the 13th year of incognito began, the currents of the divine world, which had remained largely quiescent, began to stir with a profound and gathering anxiety. The Devas, the gods of the Vedic pantheon, knew that the human conflict was merely a terrestrial shadow of their own alliances. Their loyalty, with the exception of Surya, was firmly with the Pandavas, the sons of Dharma, Vayu, and Indra. They looked down upon the Kuru Empire, and they saw one single, insurmountable obstacle to their chosen hero's victory, the king of Anga, Karna. The problem was not merely his skill, though that was formidable. The problem was his very nature. He was Jara Marana Varjita, devoid of old age and death, as long as he wore the divine armor and earrings with which he had been born. The Kavacha and Kundala were not just ornaments, they were a part of his flesh, his skin, infused with Amrita, the celestial nectar of immortality, a gift from his father Surya. No weapon, no divyastra, not even the Pashupatastra of Shiva or the Brahmastra itself could pierce this solar shield. As long as Karna wore his armor, he was, in the most literal sense, invincible in battle. Arjuna, even with his own arsenal of divine weapons, could not defeat him. For the Pandavas to win the war that everyone knew was coming, Karna's invincibility had to be removed. The champion of the gods, the king of Swarga, was Indra, a deity of complex, often pragmatic morality, the god of storms and warfare. But Indra had another, far more personal stake in this conflict. He was the divine father of Arjuna. His paternal instinct, his desire to protect his own son and ensure his victory, superseded all other codes of divine conduct. He devised a plan, a deception that was both brilliant and deeply adharmic. He knew of Karna's single, defining, and fatally uncompromising virtue, his vrata, or sacred vow, of dana, charity. Karna had sworn an oath that after his morning puja, his prayers to his father, the sun, he would not refuse any boon asked of him by a Brahmin. He would give, without question, anything that was requested. This vow was the source of his immense kirti, fame, as Danavira, the hero of charity. Indra knew that this virtue, this perfect adherence to dharma, was the very key to destroying him. But this celestial plot was not without its own counterintelligence. Surya, the sun god, the all-seeing eye of the cosmos, saw his ancient rival Indra's plan taking shape. He too was a father, and his heart ached for the son he had been forced to abandon. One night, as Karna slept, his father came to him in a dream. Surya manifested in his divine, radiant form, his light tempered with a deep, paternal sorrow. He warned his son, "Vasushena, my child, the time of your greatest trial approaches. Indra, the father of your rival, will come to you in disguise. He will take advantage of your vow, presenting himself as a Brahmin beggar, and he will ask for the one thing you must not give. He will ask for your kavacha and kundala. Do not, I implore you, grant this boon. This armor is your life, your invincibility, my protection woven into your very flesh. Offer him kingdoms, Offer him mountains of gold, but do not give him your life. And Karna listened, his heart moved by this first direct contact with the Divine Father he had never known. Yet his response defined his tragic, unbending character. He told Surya that he understood the warning, and he was grateful, but he could not comply. His life, he explained, was secondary to his security. To live a long life, having broken his sacred vow and earned the shame of refusing a Brahmin, was a fate worse than death. My fathers and my gurus have taught me that dharma must be protected, even at the cost of life, he replied. Fame is the ornament of a warrior. A warrior without fame is a man already dead. He would rather die, mortal and celebrated for his truth, than live, invincible and shamed for his falsehood. He would knowingly, consciously, walk into the trap. Surya, his heart breaking, blessed his son's impossible resolve and faded with the dawn. The day arrived just as Surya had foretold. Karna, having finished his morning devotions by the river, his body still wet and glowing from his prayers to the rising sun, was preparing to leave. An old, frail Brahmin, his back bent, his hand trembling on a staff, approached him, his eyes downcast. It was Indra, his divine radiance completely cloaked in an illusion of poverty and age. "O King of Anga," the Brahmin quavered, "I have heard of your boundless charity. I am a poor man, and I have come to ask a boon." Karna, his heart a mixture of pity and grim recognition, bowed. "It is my honor, reverend sir. Ask for anything, and it shall be yours. Gold, cattle, land, some palaces, name it, and it is given." The Brahmin shook his head. "I have no need of wealth, great king. I am old, and will not live long. I ask only for a personal gift. I ask for the armor that covers your chest and the earrings that adorn your ears." Karna smiled, a sad, bitter smile. The prophecy was fulfilled. He knew this was Indra. This was death. "Reverend sir," he tried one last time, "this armor is my very skin. To remove it is to invite death. Ask for anything else." But Indra, steadfast in his deception, insisted, "It is only this I want. A king who makes a promise must keep it." Karna let out a long breath. He had made his choice long ago. "So be it," he said. He took a small, sharp knife. The Mahabharata describes this moment as one that shook the cosmos. The gods, the siddhas, and the rishis gathered in the sky, invisible, watching in horror and awe. This was not a flaw, not an accident. This was a choice. This singular act distinguishes Karna's story from the invulnerability myths of other cultures. The Greek hero Achilles was dipped in the Styx, but his heel, held by his mother, remained his accidental, vulnerable flaw. The Norse hero Siegfried bathed in a dragon's blood, but a linden leaf fell on his back, leaving a single, unknown weak spot. Their vulnerabilities were products of circumstance. Karna's vulnerability was a product of his dharma. He was not flawed by an oversight. He was creating his own mortality, deliberately, as an act of supreme, painful honor. He plunged the knife into his own chest, and with an endurance that made Parashurama's test seem like a trifle, he began to cut the kavacha from his body. It was part of his flesh, and the act was a living flaying, a self-mutilation that should have killed him from shock alone. But his solar heritage sustained him. He peeled the divine armor from his skin, the raw, bloody, agonizing act transformed by his resolve into a sacrifice. He then cut the kundala from his ears, which were equally fused to his flesh. He stood bleeding mortal for the first time in his life, and presented the gory, still shining remnants of his divinity to the disguised Brahmin, his hands steady. "It is yours," he said. At this, the heavens themselves cried out. The universe could not bear the sight of such virtue being so cruelly exploited. Indra, his disguise vanishing, was forced to reveal his divine form, the thousand-eyed king of the gods. He was shamed, his dharma as a god completely eclipsed by the dharma of the mortal he had just tricked. His victory felt hollow, a theft rather than a triumph. The gods themselves rebuked him, and Indra, to save his own honor and mitigate the terrible karma of his deceit, felt compelled to offer the bleeding, smiling Karna a boon in return. Karna stood, his mortal flesh now a landscape of raw, unbelievable pain, his lifeblood streaming onto the sacred earth from the gaping wounds where his divine, paternal protection had been. Before him, the king of the gods, Indra, was trapped in his own divinity, his deception exposed, his honor stained by the sheer, unblemished dharma of the man he had come to ruin. The celestial observers who had gathered to watch, the Gandharvas, Siddhas, and Rishis, let out a collective sound of approbation for Karna's sacrifice and deep, silent rebuke for Indra's trickery. The karma of this act, the sin of exploiting a man's most profound virtue, was so toxic that it threatened Indra's own cosmic standing. Shamed by the truth of his son's greatest rival, the storm god knew he could not simply take the bloody armor and leave. A boon for a boon. It was the only way to mitigate the sin and rebalance the scales of dharma. His voice, no longer the quavering of a frail Brahmin, but the resonant thunder of the clouds, addressed the bleeding king. He praised Karna's truth, his unwavering commitment to his vrata, calling it a feat of integrity unseen in any of the three worlds. As a reward for this steadfastness, and as a necessary balancing of the cosmic scales, Indra offered him any boon he desired, save only for the return of his armor. Karna, his mind sharp and clear even in his agony, saw the board with perfect clarity. He was now mortal. His father's protection was gone. His guru's curse lay coiled in his memory, ready to steal his Brahmastra at the final moment. He had been tricked to benefit Arjuna, and he had one and only one chance to counter the celestial machinations aligned against him. His request was therefore surgical, precise, and aimed directly at the heart of his rival. If he was to be made vulnerable for Arjuna's sake, he would be given the means to destroy Arjuna. He asked Indra for his most powerful, most infallible offensive weapon, a weapon that could not be stopped. Indra's once again was trapped. He could not refuse the request without compounding his dishonor. Yet, to give Karna an unlimited, infallible weapon would be to merely exchange one form of invincibility for another, and his son Arjuna would be doomed. So he reached for a compromise, a solution of terrible, binding precision. He summoned from his celestial arsenal a weapon of singular, devastating power. It was the Amoga Shakti, the unfailing dart, also known as the Vasavi Shakti, as it was the very embodiment of Indra's own Vasu or divine energy. It was not a physical spear of terrestrial metal, but a concentration of divine kinetic will, a sliver of the storm god's own tejas, radiance, which hummed in his hand like a javelin of pure captured lightning. Indra presented it to Karna, and the wound-racked hero's hand closed around it, its power a stark, electric contrast to the warm, ebbing flow of his own blood. Then Indra delivered the conditions, the dharma that would bind this new, terrible gift. He explained that this Shakti was absolute. It could be used only one time, against whomever Karna invoked it, be they god, demon, or man, even the great Shiva himself. It would fly from his hand, unerringly pierce their heart, and slay them without fail. But having tasted that one life, it would immediately exhaust its purpose and return to Indra's quiver in Swarga, its divine energy expended. It was, in essence, a single, guaranteed kill. This boon, this exchange, is a masterpiece of narrative architecture within the epic, a subject of deep interest for textual scholars. The Kavacha and Kundala represented a passive invincibility, a defensive, permanent state that made Karna a narratively unsolvable problem. The Vasavi Shakti replaces this with an active, single-use, offensive power. This exchange is critical for the Mahabharata's broader plot. It removes Karna's plot armor, which had made him undefeatable, and replaces it with a Chekhov's gun, a specific named threat that hangs over the entire narrative. The story's central tension shifts from Karna cannot be killed to Karna will kill one great hero. This brilliant narrative device achieves two goals simultaneously. It makes Karna mortal and thus vulnerable to Arjuna in a final, fair duel, while simultaneously making him more terrifying than ever to the Pandava allies, as he now possesses a single, fatal bullet in his quiver, marked for their greatest champion. Karna accepted the terms. The bargain was struck. He had traded his invincibility for a single, guaranteed death. And in his mind, that death had a name, Arjuna. His destiny, which had been a broad, winding river of ambition and rejection, now channeled into a single, narrow, and violent canyon. His entire life, his entire strategy in the coming war, would now revolve around protecting this one, precious, terrible boon, saving it for the one fated duel that he craved more than life itself. Indra, his duty done, his son's invulnerable foe, now reduced to a mortal man, albeit a lethally armed one, vanished, returning to the heavens. Karna, alone on the riverbank, his body a map of agony, his hand clutching the thunderbolt, was left to heal. He was for the first time in his life vulnerable, and he was for the first time in possession of a weapon that sealed his tragic fate, locking his destiny into that final, unavoidable confrontation. The long, agonizing 13-year exile of the Pandavas, a period of profound spiritual trial and quiet military preparation, finally drew to its weary close. The 12th year in the forest had been endured, and the critical 13th year of Ajnatavasa, the incognito life spent at the court of King Virata, had been completed successfully, despite Duryodhana's most fervent efforts to discover them. The Pandavas, having fulfilled every letter of their dharmic obligation, emerged from the shadows, their identities revealed, their claim to their kingdom, Indraprastha, now legally and morally due. The political atmosphere over all of Bharata grew thick and heavy, like the breathless stillness before a monsoon. War was no longer a distant possibility. It was a gathering certainty, a storm cloud on the horizon whose winds were already pulling kings and kingdoms into two great opposing constellations. In this fraught, pre-war atmosphere, one figure moved with a grace that belied the tension, attempting to navigate the treacherous currents of dharma and diplomacy. This was Krishna of Dwaraka, the divine avatar, the cousin to both the Kauravas and the Pandavas, but whose profound philosophical and personal bond with Arjuna made his true allegiance clear. Yet Krishna, as the earthly guardian of cosmic order, was bound by his own dharma to make one final, genuine attempt to preserve the peace, to prevent the Yuga Sandhya, the twilight of the age, from descending into the full, chaotic night of a Yuga Kshaya, a world-ending war. This effort is chronicled in the Mahabharata's 5th book, the Udyoga Parva, the Book of Effort. He undertook the journey to Hastinapura himself, not as a divine warrior, but as a Shantiduta, an ambassador of peace. His arrival in the Kuru capital was met with great ceremony, but the court he entered was a house fatally divided against itself. His public appeal, delivered in the great assembly hall before the blind king Dhritarashtra, Bhishma, Drona, and the assembled court, was a masterpiece of oratory. He spoke of justice, of family, of the catastrophic, all-consuming nature of war, which he warned would act like a fire, devouring the righteous and the unrighteous alike. He begged Dhritarashtra to restrain his son, to honor the agreement, and to return to the Pandavas their rightful, modest inheritance, their half of the kingdom. The response from Duryodhana, his heart long hardened by jealousy and power, was infantile in its arrogance and absolute in its finality. He infamously declared that he would not grant the Pandavas so much as a needlepoint of land without a fight. The public embassy, as Krishna knew it would, had failed, but Krishna's diplomatic effort was not merely a public performance. He knew the true linchpin of Duryodhana's unbending confidence. It was not his own military strength, nor Shakuni's counsel, nor the vast Kuru armies. It was the unwavering, unbreakable loyalty of a single man, Karna, the king of Anga, the warrior who now held Indra's infallible Shakti. Krishna understood that if Karna could be turned, if that one pillar could be removed, Duryodhana's entire edifice of arrogance would collapse, and war could be averted. Thus, he sought a private audience with Karna, away from the poisonous intrigues of the court, a meeting that stands as one of the epic's most profound psychological and philosophical confrontations. He found Karna, perhaps in the early morning light, and his approach was not one of manipulation, but of devastating, transformative truth. Krishna, his divine omniscience unshielded, began by acknowledging Karna's greatness, his skill, and his virtue, and then he laid the truth bare, a truth that Karna had felt in his svabhava, but had never been able to prove. "You are not Sutaputra, Radeya," Krishna stated, his voice calm, his words altering the very foundations of Karna's reality. "You are not the son of Adhiratha. You are Kanyaputra, the maiden son of Pritha, whom the world knows as Kunti. Your father is the god Surya himself. You are, by birth, the eldest son of Kunti, the first and the rightful Pandava." Karna, who had spent a lifetime building a fortress of identity around the insults of his birth, was shattered. The man who had shamed him, Arjuna, was his younger brother. The woman who had fainted at the Rangabhumi was his mother. Krishna did not let the revelation settle. He immediately pressed his advantage, laying out the terms of his offer. "Come with me," he urged, his voice resonating with divine authority. "The Pandavas do not know this. When I reveal your identity, they will embrace you as their true elder king. Yudhishthira, the very embodiment of dharma, will immediately abdicate. He, Bhima, Arjuna and the twins will walk behind you, holding the chamara, the royal whisk, and the white umbrella of imperial sovereignty. You, Karna, not Yudhishthira, will be consecrated as the Samrat, the universal emperor of Bharata, on the throne of Indraprastha. And Draupadi, she who mocked you, will come to you as your rightful wife, as she is bound to the Pandava king. This was the epic's ultimate tension between birthright and merit, presented in a single agonizing choice. For his entire life, Karna had fought for his merit to be recognized despite his birth. Now Krishna was offering him the ultimate birthright, a status so pure it eclipsed even Yudhishthira's, a position that would retroactively validate every drop of his merit and erase a lifetime of humiliation. It was the crown from the Svayamvara. It was the acceptance from Drona. It was the world on a golden platter. And in this moment, Karna makes his most defining, tragic, and paradoxically honorable decision. He refused. His response to Krishna is a testament to the one dharma he held above all others, the dharma of of gratitude. "O Krishna," he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of his fated knowledge, "I know what you say is true. My heart has always sensed it. But this truth has come too late. When the world called me Suta and offered me only scorn, it was Duryodhana who held the umbrella over my head. It was he who called me king, he who shared his power, his wealth, and his very soul with me. He has eaten with me, he has trusted me, and he has already begun the preparations for a war in which he counts my arm as his single greatest strength. How can I, in this final hour, betray him? How can I abandon the man who saw my worth for the sake of a mother who cast me away and brothers who have offered me nothing but contempt?" He went further, sealing his own fate. "My mother," he said, "is Radha. My father is Adhiratha. They are the ones who found me, who did not recoil from my divine armor, who gave me love. My sacred pinda, funeral rites, are owed to them, not to the royal house that abandoned me." In this speech, Karna chooses his identity. He rejects the dharma of birthright in favor of the dharma of loyalty. He consciously chooses to remain Karna the Sutaputra because the Suta family was his true family and Duryodhana was his true friend. Krishna, the god who knew the end, simply smiled, a smile of profound divine sadness. He had respected Karna's choice, for it was, in its own way, an act of unbending dharma. "So be it, King of Anga," Krishna said. "Your decision ensures this war. The earth will drink the blood of Kshatriyas. Your loyalty, great as it is bound to a dharma, and it will lead to your destruction. Prepare for your fated meeting with Arjuna." Krishna, his final secret attempt at peace, thwarted by the one human virtue he could not overcome, left Hastinapura. The Udyoga Parva was over. The Bhishma Parva, the book of war, was about to begin. The peace embassy of Krishna, having failed in its public objective, had nonetheless succeeded in planting a seed of terrible, divine truth in the mind of Karna. The king of Anga, who had spent a lifetime defending his Sutaputra identity, now knew, with the unassailable certainty of a god's word, that his true lineage stemmed from the sun, his true mother was the Kuru queen, and his sworn enemies were his own kin. This knowledge, however, had not altered his course. His loyalty to Duryodhana, the dharma of gratitude, was, in his estimation, a bond forged by choice and honor, a bond that superseded the accidental, secret ties of blood. He had refused Krishna's imperial offer, and in doing so, had consciously, fatalistically, chosen the path of adharma and doom. Back in the Pandava camp, Krishna recounted the failure of his mission, the war drums now an inevitability. But for Kunti, the mother of the Pandavas, the news of Krishna's private meeting with Karna struck a note of pure, icy terror. She alone understood the full implication. Her firstborn, the child she had abandoned to the river, the son she had recognized in shame at the Rangabhumi, was now confirmed to be alive, to be the great Karna, and he had knowingly chosen to side against his brothers. She saw the future with a mother's dreadful, intuitive clarity. A battlefield where her sons, all 6 of them, would seek to annihilate one another. She knew of Karna's quest for the Brahmastra. She knew of Arjuna's divine arsenal, and she knew, perhaps through the whispers of the court, of the terrible, infallible Shakti Karna now possessed, a weapon clearly destined for her most celebrated son, Arjuna. Her silence, maintained for decades to protect her own honor, was now the very thing that would guarantee the destruction of her family. The maternal calculus that had once led her to abandon one son to save her reputation now demanded she act to save her other 5. She resolved in one last, desperate effort to attempt what the divine Krishna could not. She would not send an ambassador. This was a secret that could only be spoken from mother to son. She left the relative safety of the Pandava camp, or perhaps the Kuru palace itself, where she still resided, and made her way alone to the banks of the sacred Ganges. This was not a queen's procession, but the shame-filled, terrified pilgrimage of a mother about to confess a lifetime's sin. She timed her arrival for the dawn, for she knew, as all the world knew, of Karna's ironclad vrata, vow. Every morning at the rising of the sun, Karna would stand waist-deep in the river, offering his prayers to his divine father, Surya. As the first, cool gray light of morning touched the river mists, she saw him. He stood, his back to her, his divine armor, though now gone, seeming to leave a residual glow upon his skin in the rising sun. His voice, low and resonant, chanted the ancient mantras to the solar deity, his hands lifting the sacred water. He was the perfect image of a warrior priest, a son in devotion to the father she had summoned. Kunti waited on the bank, her heart a cold stone in her chest, until his devotions were complete. As he turned, his puja finished, he saw her, a solitary, veiled woman trembling on the sand. He recognized her instantly, Kunti, the queen mother, the mother of his foes. He approached, his greeting formal, respectful, but icy. He inquired why a woman of her royal stature had come to this lonely place to seek out a Sutaputra. It was in this moment, with the sound of the river lapping at the shore, the same river that had been his cradle and her accomplice, that the dam of her secrecy finally broke. The words poured out of her, a torrent of confession, grief, and terrified self-preservation. She told him everything. She told him of the sage Durvasa, of the adolescent curiosity, of the boon of the mantras. She spoke the name of his father, Surya, and she described the divine birth, the armor and earrings that were his celestial inheritance. And then, her voice breaking, she confessed her own terror, the shame of an unmarried princess, the fear of her father and her lineage, and the terrible pragmatic decision to place him in a basket and commit him to the current. I, She wept. Am the Hathabhagini, the unfortunate mother who abandoned you to those waters. Karna stood as if turned to stone, his face a mask of unreadable glacial calm, though his soul, already fractured by Krishna's words, was now splitting apart. The divine truth from the god was one thing. This human, weeping, agonizing confession from the source was another. This woman, this queen, was the source of his entire life's suffering. Every jeer of Sutaputra, every time Bhima had called him a charioteer's son, every sneer, every humiliation, Drona's rejection, Draupadi's scorn, all of it, every scar on his soul, had been carved by the act of this woman standing before him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the voice of a rediscovered son, but of a judge. He narrated his own life back to her, his words cold and precise. He told her how, by casting him away, she had denied him his kshatriya samskara, sacraments, and his dharma. He told her how, when he sought his right as a warrior, her other sons had mocked him. He told her that his mother was not the queen who had birthed and abandoned him, but Radha, the Suta woman who had found him, washed his wounds, and given him a love that was unconditional. He told her that his father was Adiratha, who had held his hand and taught him duty. He accused her directly, his voice cutting through her sobs. You did not come here today out of a sudden blossoming of maternal love, O Queen. You have come here out of fear. You have come to save your other sons. He had seen to the core of her, and she could not deny it. She confessed her fear, her terror of the coming fratricide. She begged him, clutching at his arm, to use this truth. Come with me, she pleaded, repeating Krishna's offer, but with a mother's desperate appeal. You are the eldest. Let the Pandavas serve you. Abandon Duryodhana and this adharmic war. Let me, at last, call you my son in the sight of the world. Karna looked at her, his face a canvas of profound cosmic sadness. He told her firmly that his fate was sealed, his R&M to Duryodhana, the man who had given him honor when she had given him shame, was a bond he could not break. To abandon his friend now on the eve of war would be an act of such profound treachery that it would eclipse even her sin of abandonment. He had eaten Duryodhana's salt, he had accepted his crown, and he had given his word. His path was set. He would fight for the Kauravas. He would meet his brothers in battle, and he would kill them or be killed by them. The agonizing moment, which could have been a reunion, had instead become a final, tragic confirmation. He was, and would always be, Karna, the enemy of the Pandavas, his tragic path now sealed not just by fate, but by his own unbending and terrible honor. Kunti, her last desperate plea for allegiance, shattered against the unbending wall of Karna's honor, collapsed to her knees on the damp sand of the Ganges. The truth, which she had carried like a secret, suffocating fire for decades, had finally been released, but it had not bought her peace. It had only served to illuminate the terrible, unyielding integrity of the son she had so profoundly wronged. He stood before her, not as the child of her blood, but as a king of an opposing nation, his decision as final as the rising of the sun he had just worshipped. The war was coming. The fratricide was inevitable. Her confession had changed nothing, and in her despair, her grief transformed into a different, more primal, grasping plea. If she could not save him from his dharma, perhaps she could save her other sons from his wrath. O Karna, she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper, her hands clutching at the hem of his garment. You speak of your sacred dharma to your friend, and I cannot fault it. But what of the dharma to the mother who, however sinfully, gave you life? I will not ask you to abandon your crown. I will not ask you to betray your friend. I ask you, as a beggar, for a different boon. I ask for the lives of my sons. This, at last, struck a different chord, a vibration that resonated with the very vow he had just completed. He had finished his puja to Surya, and this was the sacred hour when his vrata, as Dhanavira, the hero of charity, was absolute. He could not, by his own ironclad, self-imposed dharma, turn away any supplicant, not even this woman, the source of all his suffering. He saw the trap, the desperate maternal cunning within her grief. She had cornered him, using the very virtue he had cultivated as a shield against the world's scorn. He owed her nothing, his mind screamed. And yet, by his own rules, he owed her this boon. He was bound by the chains of his own fame. His response, when it came, was a masterpiece of tragic, legalistic precision, an act of profound, chilling magnanimity wrapped in the cold language of a fatal bargain. You have come to me as a supplicant, O Queen, he stated, his voice flat, and my vow holds. I will grant you a boon. You will not have to fear for the lives of all your sons, only for one. He paused, letting the grim maternal calculus of his words sink in. You have 5 sons now, as the world knows them. Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva. At the end of this war, I promise you, you will still have 5 sons. Kunti looked at him, her tear-streaked face a mask of confusion, uncomprehending. He elaborated, his voice devoid of emotion, as if dictating the terms of a treaty. Your sons, Yudhishthira, the king, Bhima, the mace-wielder, and the twins, Nakula and Sahadeva. They are safe from me. I will meet them in battle. I will shatter their bows. I will break their maces. I will disarm them, and I may, in the heat of combat, shame them with defeat. But I will not strike a fatal blow. My hand will be stayed. You have my word. I will spare them so that you may have them. He stopped, his gaze hardening as he spoke the name that was the core of his entire existence, the pivot upon which his whole life had turned. But Arjuna, I will not spare. He is my rival. He is my fated enemy. I have sworn to kill him, and he has sworn to kill me. Between us, there can be no mercy. He is the price of my boon. On the battlefield, one of us will die. He looked at her, his eyes as bright and merciless as the sun he served. Thus, he concluded, your number will be preserved. If I die at Arjuna's hand, you will still have your 5 Pandavas. But if I succeed, if I slay Arjuna, you will have me, your firstborn, and the other 4. Your status as the mother of 5 great heroes will remain, no matter the outcome. This is the boon I grant. This promise, this pratijna, must be understood in the context of the epic's unique moral landscape. In the Mahabharata, an oath is not a mere statement of personal intent, as it might be in our modern understanding. It is a form of sacred, verbal technology. When a hero like Karna or Bhishma makes a vrata, they are actively manipulating the very architecture of dharma and karma. The spoken word, charged with the speaker's own tapasya, ascetic energy, becomes a binding, objective, and inescapable reality. It is a self-imposed fate, a law as real and immutable as Parashurama's curse or the Brahmin's malediction. Karna was not just saying he wouldn't kill the four Pandavas. He was, in that moment, welding a divine invisible shield around them, a shield that only he was bound to respect. He was, in effect, cursing himself with mercy, shackling his own arm. The strategic implications of this vow were catastrophic for the Kaurava cause. Duryodhana's greatest champion, the man he believed was his infallible trump card, the general who had conquered the world for him, had just voluntarily and secretly neutered himself. He had promised to pull his fatal punches against 4/5 of the Pandava leadership. He was now a general entering a war having vowed not to kill the enemy's king, Yudhishthira, their strongest warrior, Bhima, or their supporting flank, Nakula and Sahadeva. His entire vast solar-given, Parashurama-honed arsenal was now focused, by his own honorable choice, on a single, impossible target. Kunti, receiving this terrible partial victory, could do nothing but weep, her sobs a mixture of relief and amplified dread. She had saved 4 sons, only to confirm the fated, bloody duel between the 2 she loved most, the son of her body and the son of her heart. She turned and departed, her secret now a shared burden, leaving Karna alone on the riverbank, the sun now high in the sky, illuminating a man who had just signed his own death warrant, all in the name of an honor his mother had denied him. Karna returned from the banks of the Ganges, his face a mask of iron, his mind a silent battlefield. His terrible, magnanimous promise to Kunti was now a new, invisible shackle, a private dharma that ran perpendicular to the public, martial loyalty he had sworn to Duryodhana. He re-entered the bustling, sprawling Kaurava encampment, a temporary city of 1,000,000 soldiers, its banners snapping in the dry wind that blew across the sacred plain of Kurukshetra, the field of the Kurus, a sight long associated with ritual sacrifice and soon with the greatest sacrifice of all. The time for embassies, for secret confessions, and for moral maneuvering was over. The conch shells were being tested, the elephants armored, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of sharpened steel and the low murmur of an army preparing for a generational war. The first critical order of business was the formal consecration of a Senapati, a generalissimo, to command the vast, allied Kaurava host of 11 Akshauhinis. For Duryodhana, this was his first, painful compromise. His heart, his loyalty, and his strategic mind all screamed for one man, Karna, the Daanavira, the warrior who had conquered the world for him, the man whose skill, he believed, was forged to be the antidote to Arjuna. But the political realities of his own court and the sheer weight of tradition made this impossible. An army of this magnitude, composed of allied kings and ancient vassals, would not follow a Sutaputra into the apocalypse, regardless of his divine gifts. The command had to fall to the eldest, the most revered, the unassailable patriarch of the Kuru dynasty, Bhishma, the son of Shantanu, and Ganga, the Pitamaha, the Grand Seer. Bhishma, bound by his own ancient tragic vow to protect the throne of Hastinapura, accepted the command, so his heart heavy, knowing he was the general of an adharmic cause, fated to fight against the grandchildren he loved. With the command structure set, Bhishma, in his new role as general, began the traditional formal review of his forces, a cataloging of the great warriors on both sides. This was not merely an inventory, but a public, ritualized ranking, defining each hero's capability, a moral and military judgment. In the open war council, surrounded by Duryodhana, Drona, Kripa, and all the allied kings, Bhishma began his assessment. He spoke of the Pandava heroes, praising Yudhishthira's dharma, Bhima's strength, and Arjuna's divine skill, calling them Atirathas, great chariot warriors, capable of fighting tens of thousands simultaneously. He spoke of his own side, of Drona, of his own student Ashwathama. Then his gaze fell, cold and deliberate, upon the king of Anga. This was the moment the fragile, poisoned truce within the Kaurava high command shattered. Bhishma, his voice clear and laced with the ice of a lifetime's disdain, spoke of Karna. He did not deny his skill, but he publicly, brutally mocked his status and his character. He called him arrogant, boastful, and most cuttingly, a man of low birth, a Sutaputra whose pride had blinded his friend Duryodhana. Then he delivered the final, unforgivable military insult. He declared Karna to be only an Ardha-Rathi, a half-a warrior. His reasoning was technically sound, but delivered with maximum venom. Karna, he announced, was flawed. He had been cursed by his guru Parashurama to forget his weapons. He had been cursed by a Brahmin to have his chariot fail, and he had foolishly, vainly given away his divine, impenetrable armor. He was, Bhishma declared, an incomplete hero, a broken weapon. For Karna, this was the final, unendurable humiliation. To be called Sutaputra by Draupadi was a social sting. To be rejected by Drona was a professional slight. But to be declared a half-warrior by the generalissimo of his own army in front of the very kings he had conquered was an assault on his svabhava, his very being. His honor, the one thing he had built from the ashes of his birth, was being publicly incinerated by the man he was expected to follow into battle. His rage, a lifetime's accumulation, was absolute. He stood, his Vijaya bow in his hand, and made his own terrible countervow. As long as this man, he spat, pointing at Bhishma, this elder who speaks with a venom unbefitting his age, as long as he leads this army, I shall not fight. I will not lift my bow. I will not draw a single arrow in his name. Let the Pitamaha win this war with his own great skill. Only when he has fallen, when his body has met the earth, will I, Karna, enter the battlefield to meet Arjuna. This was a military and political catastrophe for Duryodhana. His two greatest assets, the immovable defensive rock of Bhishma and the unstoppable offensive spear of Karna, had just declared their mutual exclusivity. The Kaurava army would be forced to fight with its single greatest offensive champion sitting in a pout of pride in the reserves. This animosity, so deep, so bitter, and so profoundly self-destructive to the Kaurava cause, has remained one of the Mahabharata's most enduring historiographic and scholarly mysteries. Why this hatred? Why would Bhishma, the wise patriarch, so deliberately alienate his side's most powerful warrior? Why would Karna, whose loyalty to Duryodhana was absolute, abandon his friend for the first 10 critical days of the war over a matter of pride? Scholars of textual criticism, analyzing the epic's many layers, have suggested that this conflict is not mere personal animosity, but a profound, symbolic clash of two opposing and perhaps textually distinct heroic ideals. Bhishma is the very embodiment of the old guard. He is a hero of the Treta Yuga mold, a man whose power derives from his vows, vrata, particularly his terrible oath of brahmacharya, celibacy. His dharma is static, rigid, bound to lineage, tradition, and the Kuru throne, even when that throne is occupied by a dharma. He is the ultimate tragic purist of birthright. Karna, by contrast, is the new hero, a figure who represents the epic's fascination with the Dvapara Yuga's moral chaos. His power is not from vows, but from his innate nature, svabhava, and his divine blood. His dharma is not to a state or a lineage, which brutally rejected him, but a dynamic, personal, and passionate loyalty to an individual, his friend Duryodhana. His primary virtues are not chastity and tradition, but dana, charity, and arnam, the debt of gratitude. Bhishma, the hero of vow, cannot comprehend Karna, the hero of merit and charity. Karna, the hero of personal loyalty, cannot respect Bhishma, the hero of impersonal compromised duty. Their feud, then, may represent a collision of two different, ancient heroic traditions that were stitched together by the epic's final redactors. It is the old world of static dharma clashing with the new world of individual karma. This is the hypothesis that gives their mutual suicidal pride a deep philosophical resonance. And so the war began, and for 10 days, as the Bhishma Parva unfolded, Karna sat in his tent, a caged lion, listening to the roars of Bhima and the twang of Arjuna's Gandiva bow, forced by his own honor to remain idle while the grandsire he despised led his friend's army to ruin. For 10 long, agonizing days, Karna had sat in his pavilion, a caged son, his Vijaya bow silent, his promise to Duryodhana held in abeyance by his own rigid, prideful vow against Bhishma. He was forced to listen to the roar of a war he had been born to fight, a war where his chief rival, Arjuna, was wreaking havoc on the Kuru army, and his friend Duryodhana was daily slipping closer to despair as the grandsire's defensive strategy failed to produce a victory. On the evening of the 10th day, the sounds of battle faded into a profound, grieving silence, broken by the news that electrified the camp. Bhishma, the Pitamaha, had fallen. He had not been killed, for his dharma was such that he could choose the moment of his own death, but he had been felled, pierced by 1,000 arrows from Arjuna's bow, who had used the Panchala prince Shikandi, a man who had been a woman in a past life, as a human shield, knowing Bhishma's vow forbade him from ever striking a woman. The grandsire, his body a bed of arrows, lay on the sacred plain of Kurukshetra, his promise to protect the throne fulfilled, his role in the war at an end. Karna's world, which had been frozen by his own oath, was suddenly, violently set in motion. His vow was fulfilled. The man who had called him Ardarathi was no longer in command. His time had come. That night, under a sky of cold stars, Karna went out onto the blood-soaked field, a solitary figure moving through the carnage toward the place where the greatest hero of the age lay dying. He found Bhishma, serene, his gaze fixed on the heavens, and in that private, moonlit moment, the great bitter animosity that had defined their relationship finally dissolved. Karna prostrated himself, his crowned head touching the earth near his grandsire's feet, his voice, for the first time, one of pure filial respect. He identified himself as Radeya, the Sutaputra who had offended him. But Bhishma, his voice weak but clear, stopped him. The dying patriarch, now free from the political constraints of command, saw with the clarity of the near dead. He acknowledged Karna's true, divine nature, calling him the son of Kunti and Surya, a hero equal to any, and he confessed his own tactic. He had insulted Karna deliberately, knowing his pride, hoping to keep him from the field, to save the Pandavas, his grandsons, from Karna's invincible power. He gave Karna his blessing, anointing him as the Kuru's true champion, and urged him to fight not with hatred, but with his Kshatriya dharma. This reconciliation was a profound release. Karna returned to the Kaurava camp as a new man, his bitterness gone, replaced by a focused, lethal resolve. The next morning, Duryodhana, though grieving Bhishma, was filled with a manic, rekindled hope. His first choice for general was naturally Drona, the great Brahmin Acharya who had taught them all, and Drona, his loyalty bound by the Kuru salt, accepted the Abhisheka, consecration. And on that 11th day of the war, as Dronacharya formed his great Garuda, eagle battle formation, Karna, the king of Anga, rode out in his chariot for the first time. The Mahabharata describes his entry as a second sunrise on the battlefield. The entire Kuru army, which had been demoralized and broken, felt his tejas, radiance, and roared his name, their morale instantly restored. He was the great hope, the living countermeasure to Arjuna, the man who had conquered the world, finally unleashed. The battlefield itself, Kurukshetra, was a character in this drama, a place chosen with profound ancient significance. This is not a mythical landscape. It is a very real, very tangible plain in the modern-day Indian state of Haryana, a vast, flat expanse of land situated between the two sacred rivers, the Sarasvati and the Drishadvati. 4 millennia before the epic was even composed, this plain was known as Dharma Kshetra, the field of righteousness, and Brahma Vedi, the altar of Brahma. Archaeological surveys of the region, including sites like Amin, have confirmed continuous habitation stretching back to the Painted Grey Ware, PGW period, the very culture of the Kuru kingdom. This was a land steeped in sacred history, a place where the devas themselves were said to have performed yajnas. To choose this as the setting for the war was a deliberate act by the epic's composers. This would not be a mere war of men, but a dharma yuddha, a sacrificial yajna where the kshatriya class would be the offering and the field itself was the altar. Into this dharma kshetra, Karna now plunged. He was no longer the generalissimo, but the chief commander under Drona, and his impact was immediate and devastating. He became the spear tip of the Kaurava army, seeking out his fated rival, but he was constantly intercepted by the other Pandava heroes. It was here that his secret, terrible promise to Kunti was first tested. He met Yudhishthira in single combat, the king of Dharma, and with contemptuous ease, he shattered Yudhishthira's bow, broke his chariot, and left him disarmed and humiliated, forcing him to flee the field. But he did not strike the killing blow. He met Bhima, the great Vayuputra, and their duel was a clash of titans. But again, Karna, remembering his mother's plea, contented himself with defeating and mocking his brother, not killing him. He scythed through the Pandava ranks, a force of nature, his honor preventing him from landing the fatal strokes that could have ended the war. For 5 days, the Dronaparva unfolded, a brutal, grinding war of attrition under Drona's brilliant, if reluctant, command. Drona's true objective was the capture of Yudhishthira, and Karna's was the slaying of Arjuna. But the Pandavas, led by Krishna's divine strategy, thwarted them at every turn. The war reached its chaotic, desperate zenith, culminating in Drona's own tragic, adharmic death. Finally, on the evening of the 15th day, The Kaurava army was once again broken, demoralized, and for the second time, leaderless. Duryodhana, his second great general now dead, his army a weeping, terrified rabble, turned to the one man who had never failed him, the one pillar that had always held, the one hero who he believed was still destined for victory. That night, in a solemn, desperate ceremony, the Brahmins performed the Abhisheka, and Duryodhana, his voice thick with hope and fear, consecrated Karna as the third and final Senapati of the Kuru army. The Karna Parva, the book of his destiny, was about to begin. On the morning of the 16th day, as the first rays of his father, Surya, illuminated the dew-stained, ravaged earth of Kurukshetra, Karna ascended his chariot as the third and final Senapati of the Kuru army. The conch shells sounded, a deep, mournful wail that was answered by the roars of the 11 Akshauhinis, their spirits miraculously rekindled by the sight of their new commander, his Vijaya bow in hand, his presence a promise of restored glory. Duryodhana, at his side, felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hope, for this was the day he had dreamed of, the day his champion, his Dhanavira, would finally lead the charge and end the war. But as Karna raised his hand to signal the advance, his gaze sweeping over the enemy vyuha, formation, his heart was not filled with the fire of a new general. It was a cold, hollow chamber, heavy with the knowledge of a sacrifice he had been forced to make just 2 nights prior, a sacrifice that had already sealed his fate. His mind flashed back to the 14th night of the war, a night that had begun in chaos and descended into a literal hell. The battle, by all sacred rules, should have ended at sunset, but Drona, in a desperate, adharmic bid to fulfill his promise to capture Yudhishthira, had allowed the conflict to rage on into the pitch blackness. It was a soldier's nightmare, a chaotic, churning melee fought by the flickering, demonic light of torches, a landscape of confused sounds, of men striking friends and foes alike. And into this darkness, the Pandavas had unleashed their most terrifying, non-human asset, Gatotkacha, the half-human, half-Rakshasa son of Bhima and the daemoness Hidimbi. Gatotkacha was a being of Maya, of illusion, but his true, terrible nature was nocturnal. As the darkness deepened, his power, far from waning, swelled to apocalyptic proportions. He was a Rakshasa in his element. He became a sky-born terror, a shadowy colossus who cloaked himself in illusion, vanishing and reappearing, his laughter a booming psychological poison that shattered the Kuru morale. He was not a single warrior. He was an army. He rained down a torrent of iron bolts, massive boulders, and flaming projectiles, his Maya creating illusions of 1,000 attacking demons. The Kuru army, blind, terrified, and exhausted, simply disintegrated. Elephants stampeded, chariots shattered, and men were slaughtered by the thousands, crushed by an enemy they could not see. Even Drona, the great Acharya, was powerless. His divyastras were swallowed by the Rakshasa's illusions. The Kuru army was not just being defeated, it was being annihilated. Duryodhana, his arrogance finally cracking, was gripped by an animalistic terror. He saw his entire army, his kingdom, his brothers, and his own life about to be extinguished in a single, horrific night. He raced through the carnage, his chariot lurching over the dead, until he found Karna. He fell at Karna's feet, a king begging his vassal. "Karna, my friend, we are lost," he screamed, his voice breaking. "Drona has failed. Everyone has failed. Only you can stop this Rakshasa. Only you can save us. Use your power. Use the Shakti." This was the moment Karna had dreaded more than death. The Vasavi Shakti, the infallible dart from Indra, was his one precious hoarded treasure. It was not a weapon. It was his destiny. It was the physical guarantee of his vrata to kill Arjuna. His entire life, every humiliation, every drop of sweat, every moment of his cruel, fated existence had been channeled toward the single purpose of using that Shakti on the son of Indra. To use it on anyone else, even this supernatural monster, was to commit strategic and personal suicide. He refused, his voice tight. "No, my king, that weapon is reserved for Arjuna. This Rakshasa is a lesser foe." But Duryodhana, mad with fear, only wept and pointed. "What Arjuna?" he cried. "There will be no duel with Arjuna if we are all dead. Look, he is devouring the army. Save us, Karna. Save me. Your loyalty, your dharma is to me." Karna looked at the battlefield. He saw the truth in his friend's terrified words. The army was gone. His dharma to his king, the art and aim that defined his entire moral code, demanded he act. If he saved the Shakti but allowed the army to be destroyed, he would have saved his vengeance but lost his honor. He would have nothing left to kill Arjuna for. In that split second, a choice of pure cosmic agony, he chose his loyalty to Duryodhana over his rivalry with Arjuna. He chose his friend over his fate. With a heart that felt as if it were being torn from his chest, he nodded. He raised his arm, and for the first time, he invoked the mantra for the Amoga Shakti. It appeared in his hand, a javelin of pure, blinding light, a sliver of Indra's own vas that illuminated the entire battlefield like a second terrible sun. He roared Ghatotkacha's name, and the Rakshasa, seeing the divine weapon, knew his time had come. Karna hurled it. The Shakti did not fly so much as it willed itself across the sky, a streak of infallible doom. It tore through every illusion, every Maya shield Ghatotkacha conjured, and as promised, it buried itself deep in the center of his chest. The Rakshasa, his illusions vanishing, let out one final deafening roar. In his death, he magically expanded his body to a mountainous size and, with his last act of loyalty, crashed himself down onto the Kuru divisions below, killing another Akshauhini even as he died. The darkness was silent. The Kuru army, saved, let out a weak, shuddering cheer. But Karna stood on his chariot, a hollow, broken man. The Shakti had vanished, its light returning to Indra's heaven. In the Pandava camp, a great wail of grief went up as Bhima mourned his son. But as the texts famously note, amid the weeping, one man was seen to be rejoicing. Krishna, the divine charioteer, actually laughed and embraced Arjuna, who was horrified by his glee. "Why are you celebrating, Madhava?" Arjuna asked. Krishna, his face alight with strategic victory, replied, "Because, my friend, the war is now won. As long as Karna held that Shakti, you were a dead man. I could not have saved you. By sacrificing his son, Bhima has allowed Ghatotkacha to do what no Deva could. He has disarmed Karna. Now he is just a man bound by curses, a man whose armor is gone. Now you can kill him." Karna, riding out on this 16th morning, his first day as Senapati, felt the truth of Krishna's words in his very bones. He was leading his army to a victory he could no longer deliver. He was a general whose greatest weapon was already spent, a sacrifice made not for his own glory, but for the Ar-Enam he owed his friend. The 16th day of the war had ended in a bloody, indecisive stalemate, a brutal preview of the Kuru army's renewed spirit under their new Senapati. Karna, though hollowed by the loss of his Shakti, had been a whirlwind of martial fury, his promise to Kunti forcing him into a strange, new, and terrible kind of warfare, a war of humiliation, not annihilation. He had defeated Bhima and Yudhishthira, disarmed them, mocked them, and let them flee, his words leaving deeper, more venomous wounds than his arrows. He had proven his superiority, but his secret vow had prevented him from capitalizing on it. A strategic self-sabotage that left the Pandava leadership wounded in pride but crucially still alive. As the sun set on that first day of his command, he knew the reckoning was fast approaching. He had spent his one great guaranteed weapon. He had spared 4 of his 5 fated enemies. All that remained was the single, central duel upon which his entire, tragic life had been focused. The morning of the 17th day dawned heavy and red, the sky stained with the color of the earth below. This was the day that the Mahabharata itself would immortalize as the Karna Parva, the 8th, and in many ways, the most emotionally climactic book of the entire epic. The textual dedication of an entire Parva to this single final day of Karna's life is a profound statement by the epic's redactors. It is the narrative fulcrum, the point where all the boons and curses, the secret births and mistaken identities, the tangled loyalties and ancient hatreds would finally converge and find their violent resolution. The Bhishma Parva had lasted 10 days, the Drona Parva 5. The Karna Parva would last only 2. Its focus is a tight, brilliant, agonizing spotlight on the final, fatal performance of its titular hero. Karna rode out as Generalissimo, his mind preternaturally clear. He had a new charioteer, a fact that was itself a product of Dharma's intricate, cruel games. Duryodhana, knowing the supreme importance of this day, had insisted that Karna have a Sarathi, charioteer, whose skill could match Krishna's. He had begged Shalya, the king of Madra, and the maternal uncle of the Pandava twins, Nakula and Sahadeva, to take the reins. Shalya, a great king in his own right, had been tricked by Duryodhana's hospitality into granting a boon, and that boon was to serve the Kuru cause. He was now, in a twist of bitter irony, forced to serve as the charioteer to the Sutaputra he despised, all while his heart ached for his nephews on the other side. This unwilling partnership was a battle within the chariot, a constant stream of psychological warfare, with Shalya subtly, constantly undermining Karna's confidence with backhanded compliments and praise for Arjuna, a 5th column operating at the very heart of the Kuru High Command. Despite this internal friction, Karna was a master. He organized the Kuru army into a formidable vyuha formation, perhaps the Makara, sea monster, or the Sarvatobhadra, perfect square, designed for aggressive, all-encompassing assault. The conch shells blew, and the 17th day began. The Pandavas, knowing Karna was now mortal, advanced with a grim, new determination. The day became a series of masterful, brutal duels, a showcase of Karna's complete, unblemished prowess as a general and a warrior. His promise to Kunti was tested for the final time, and the results were devastating. He met Yudhishthira, the king of Dharma, in a duel that was a near-perfect echo of the previous day, but infused with a new, terrifying lethality. Yudhishthira, burning from the prior day's insults, fought with the Dharma Raja's righteous fury, but it was useless. Karna, his Vijaya bow singing, was a different order of being. He moved like a storm, his arrows a golden rain. He shattered Yudhishthira's bow, splintered his javelins, and then with a crescent-tipped arrow, he shattered the unconquerable divine armor that Yudhishthira himself possessed. The king stood exposed, disarmed, and terrified. Karna's chariot bore down on him, his arrow drawn to the string, the fletching brushing his ear. This was the moment. He could end the war. He could kill the Pandava king, and the dharma of the war would collapse. And in that instant, his vow, his mother's weeping face on the banks of the Ganges, stayed his hand. He did not lower his bow. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of verbal poison, a cruelty far deeper than an arrow. "Run, son of Kunti," he sneered, his voice carrying across the field. "You are a Brahmin, not a Kshatriya. You are a man of words and sacrifices, not of war. Go back to the forest, for you have no place here." He punctuated the insult by firing a final arrow that just grazed his helmet, a gesture of ultimate contempt. Yudhishthira, his honor in tatters, his body wounded, fled the field in a shame so profound it was a living death. Karna then turned his attention to the true muscle of the Pandava army, Bhima. The Vayu-putra, still roaring with grief for his son Ghatotkacha, charged Karna, their duel a clash of elemental forces. Bhima's mace against Karna's bow. The text describes them as two maddened elephants, each shattering the other's weapons. But again, Karna's pure, divine-level skill prevailed. He disarmed Bhima, broke his chariot, and left the mighty hero standing on the ground, defenseless, his chest heaving. Karna drew his bow, his arrow aimed directly at the heart of the man who had called him Sutaputra his entire life. The temptation to end it, to silence that voice forever, was absolute, but the vow held. He would not kill Bhima. He turned his chariot away, a gesture of such profound dismissal that it enraged Bhima more than any wound. Karna was supreme. He had, in single combat, defeated and routed the king of Dharma and the strongest of men. He had proven Bhishma's Ardharathi insult a bitter, jealous lie. He was the Sarvarathi, the warrior of all warriors. The Pandava army, seeing its two greatest champions, after Arjuna defeated and humiliated, broke and fled. The Kuru army roared, sensing total victory. Karna, his gaze sweeping the field, saw only one obstacle left. On the Pandava side, Arjuna, witnessing Yudhishthira's flight, was now gripped by a cold, sacred rage. Krishna, his face serene, his strategic mind finally seeing the moment he had engineered, turned his divine white horses. From across the field, Shalya, with a grim nod, turned Karna's. The two chariots, one bearing the sun, the other the storm, began to move toward each other. The rest of the battlefield, the millions of soldiers, the screams, the elephants, all of it, faded into an irrelevant, silent backdrop. The duel for which the age had waited had at last begun. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath as the two greatest champions of the age, the twin poles of the Mahabharata's martial and moral universe, finally converged. On one side, Arjuna, the Gandiva bow in hand, his chariot guided by the serene, divine intelligence of Krishna. On the other, Karna, his Vijaya bow humming, his chariot steered by the grim, reluctant King Shalya. The noise of the wider battle, the screams of the dying and the trumpeting of elephants, seemed to recede into a distant, irrelevant hum, as if the cosmos had zoomed in, focusing all its light and shadow on this single faded patch of blood-soaked earth. This was not merely a duel, it was the Yuga Sandhya made manifest, a clash of two opposing dharmas. Arjuna, the hero of divine right and established order, and Karna, the hero of personal loyalty and tragic, meritocratic pride. Their battle began, and it was a war within a war. The sky vanished, obscured by a storm of gold-fletched arrows, a torrent of divyastras that ripped the air apart. This was the pinnacle of Dhanurvidya, a spectacle of superhuman power that left both armies, Pandava and Kaurava, staring in a shared, frozen awe. Karna, his Senapati fury now channeled into a single point, was magnificent. He unleashed the Bhargavastra, the personal weapon of his guru Parashurama, which exploded into 1,000,000 lesser arrows, a net of divine fire that threatened to consume the Pandava army. But Arjuna, guided by Krishna, countered with his own Brahmastra, a weapon of even greater creator-level power, which swallowed the Bhargavastra whole, neutralizing the threat. They were perfectly, impossibly matched. For every Agnyastra, fire weapon Karna summoned, Arjuna replied with the Varunastra, water weapon. For every Vayavastra, wind weapon Arjuna unleashed, Karna would anchor himself with a Parvatastra, mountain weapon. They were the two greatest students of the two greatest gurus, Drona and Parashurama, and in their exchange, the knowledge of their masters found its ultimate devastating expression. Shalya in the chariot continued his psychological war, hissing, "See how Arjuna fights. His aim is perfect. Your arrows falter, Karna." But Karna was beyond his taunts, his focus absolute, his solar tejas burning so brightly that for a time he seemed to gain the upper hand, his arrows wounding Arjuna and drawing blood, pushing the Pandava hero to the very brink of defeat. And it was in this moment, this zenith of Karna's power, as he drew back his bowstring for what he felt would be the final victorious shot, that the universe, bound by the oaths of the past, finally collected its debts. The first curse, the promise of the dying earth, struck. There was a sickening lurch, a sound of splintering wood and grinding earth. The left wheel of Karna's magnificent war chariot, the chariot that had flown across the plains of Bharata on his Digvijaya, suddenly, inexplicably, sank. Bhumi Devi, the earth goddess, fulfilling the curse of the Brahmin whose innocent cow Karna had slain, had reached up from the mud, a mud made thick with the blood of millions, and seized her payment. The chariot stopped dead, tilted at a grotesque, impossible angle, its axle snapping, its horses screaming. Karna, a Rathi, a chariot warrior, was suddenly, absurdly, uncharioted. He was trapped, a grounded eagle, his perfect firing platform gone, his mobility annihilated. His charioteer, Shalya, his duty to Duryodhana now complete, simply dropped the reins and with a final contemptuous look abandoned the mired chariot, taking his leave from the battlefield. Karna was alone, but even in this his spirit was not broken. He was a kshatriya, and this was a test. He leaped from the useless chariot, his feet sinking into the mud. He held up his hand, his bow lowered, and he called out to his rival, his voice ringing across the field in an appeal, not for mercy, but for the one thing he had always craved, dharma. "Arjuna," he shouted, his voice clear and proud, "hold your arrow. You are a hero of the Kuru line, a man who knows the sacred rules of Dharma Yuddha. You see, my chariot is destroyed. I am on the ground, unarmed for this moment, at a disadvantage. The law forbids you from striking a warrior in such a state. Grant me this honorable pause. Allow me to free my wheel from the earth. Once I am restored, our great duel can resume as equals. Arjuna, his own Gandiva bow drawn, his arrow aimed at Karna's heart, hesitated. His hand trembled. What Karna said was true. It was the dharma of war. To strike a disarmed, uncharioted man was murder, not combat. His entire Kshatriya upbringing warred with his need for vengeance. But in his chariot, Krishna, the divine avatar, the embodiment of a dharma that transcended human rules, felt no such conflict. His face, usually serene, was a mask of cold, divine fury. He turned his gaze upon Karna, and his voice, the voice of Kala, time itself, thundered across the field. Dharma? Krishna roared, his words a verbal lightning bolt that struck Karna with more force than any arrow. You, of all men, dare to speak the word dharma in your final hour. Where, O Karna, was this sacred dharma when you and Drona and Kripa and Ashwathama and Duryodhana, 6 great chariot warriors, surrounded my beloved son, the boy Abhimanyu, who was alone, his chariot broken, his weapons gone? Where was your dharma when you all fell upon him like hyenas and butchered him, a child, against every rule you now invoke? Krishna's voice rose, a terrible crescendo of karmic reckoning. Where was your dharma, son of Surya, when you sat in the assembly hall and watched a woman, your own sister-in-law, dragged by her hair into court? Where was your dharma when you called her a harlot for having 5 husbands, and when you, with your own mouth, encouraged Dushasana to strip her naked before the king? You sowed adharma your entire life, Karna. You poisoned Bhima, you supported the burning of the Lakh house, you enabled the rigged game of dice. You have reaped what you have sown. The dharma you so meticulously abandoned has in your final moment abandoned you. Karna stood, paralyzed, as this verbal history of his sins washed over him. He had no reply. He knew in his soul that every word was true. This was not an accident. This was karma. This was the Brahmin's curse. But even now, he would not yield. In one last, desperate, defiant act, he turned from Krishna, his gaze locking back on Arjuna. He would stake everything on his final, ultimate weapon. He would unleash the Brahmastra, even from the ground, and end this. He drew his last, finest arrow, touched it to his lips, and summoned the sacred mantra taught to him by his guru, the invocation that could end the world. And his mind, his perfect warrior's mind, was empty, a cold, agonizing void. The mantras was gone. The words would not come. Parashurama's curse, the price of his ancient lie, had struck. The guru's knowledge, gained through deception, had vanished at the precise fatal moment of his greatest need. The net was closed. His armor was gone. His Shakti was spent. His chariot was mired. His Brahmastra was forgotten. He stood on the mud of Kurukshetra, stripped of every boon, every weapon, and every hope, a mortal man paying a divine price. Karna stood in the mud, a grounded son, his hand frozen on an arrow he could not empower. The mantra was gone, a hollow void in his perfect warrior's memory, the final, devastating payment for a lie told a lifetime ago. He was, in this instant, completely and cosmically undone. His invincibility, a gift from his father, he had given away in an act of supreme charity. His infallible weapon, a gift from Indra, he had spent in an act of supreme loyalty. His mobility, a gift of his station, was stolen by the earth in an act of supreme justice. And now his knowledge, a gift from his guru, was stolen by that same guru's curse. He stood exposed, his hands, which had conquered the world, now empty. In the Pandava chariot, Arjuna's hand trembled, his gun of a bow still drawn, the Anjalikastra arrow aimed but not released. He was a kshatriya, and the man before him was unarmed, uncharioted, and in profound distress. To shoot now was not dharmayuddha, it was hatya, it was murder. His entire being recoiled from the act. But Krishna, his divine charioteer, his gaze as cold and hard as the vajra of Indra, roared his final, terrible command. Now, Arjuna, what are you waiting for? His voice was not the calm counsel of a friend, but the impatient, irresistible command of Kala, of time itself. Do not hesitate. This man is the linchpin of all adharma. He is the root of this war. While he lives, this conflict cannot end. Do not let this false, misplaced dharma of yours, this warrior's protocol, stand in the way of the cosmic dharma. Slay him while he is trapped by his own karma. This is not your act. It is the act of the universe claiming its due. Slay him for your son, Abhimanyu, whom he helped butcher. Slay him for Draupadi, whom he called a harlot. Slay him for the justice of the Yuga. Release your arrow. Arjuna, his eyes blinded by tears, his heart breaking, understood. This was not a duel. It was an execution. He was not a warrior in this moment. He was an instrument. His brother, the man who should have been his king, stood before him, a sacrifice prepared by his own life. Karna heard Krishna's words. He looked at Arjuna, his rival, his brother, the hand of his own fate. He knew the end had come. He did not beg. He did not plead. The web of curses was complete. In one last, defiant, hopeless gesture, he dropped his bow, and with a kshatriya's final, desperate strength, he tried to lift the sunken wheel of his chariot from the mud, to die on his feet, a warrior to the last. He put his entire sun-given strength into the act, but the earth, bound by the Brahmin's curse, held fast. The wheel would not budge. He let go. He stood up straight, his body covered in the blood of battle and the mud of his own undoing. He looked away from Arjuna, his gaze turning east toward the rising sun, his father. His face, for the first time in his life, was not a mask of pride or rage or ambition. It was a mask of profound, tragic, and final acceptance. He had run his race. He had kept his vows. His arnam to Duryodhana was paid. His promise to Kunti was kept. His life, a long, agonizing argument with destiny, was over. Strike, Arjuna, Krishna commanded, his voice now soft. It is time. Arjuna, his face a contortion of grief, drew the Gandiva string back to his ear. He loosed the Anjalikastra, the folded hand's arrow, a celestial bladed missile designed for a single, sacred purpose. It flew, a streak of light, a tear from a god's eye, and it crossed the small, terrible distance between the two chariots. It struck Karna at the neck, and with a clean, merciful, and absolute finality, it severed his head from his body. His Vijaya bow, the bow of Shiva, fell from his loosened grasp. His body, the body that had worn the kavacha and borne the weight of 1,000 insults, stood for a single, impossible instant, and then collapsed into the mud that had claimed it. The war, for a moment, stopped. Both armies, Pandava and Kaurava lowered their weapons, stunned into a shared grieving silence by the death of the sun. And as his head touched the earth, a light, a tejas of pure, blazing solar energy, a light that had been trapped inside his mortal form, erupted from his fallen body. It streaked into the sky, a meteor in reverse, and it flew, bright and pure, across the heavens, merging at last with the disk of his father, Surya. The sun itself seemed to dim in that moment, as if the world's witness had flinched in grief. Karna's death remains the single most debated, most morally ambiguous, and most heartbreaking moment in the entire Mahabharata. It was a victory for dharma that could only be achieved through a profound act of adharma. It was not a fair fight. It was a fated assassination, a cosmic necessity, the gods and the rishis conspiring to remove the one man whose personal virtues of loyalty and honor were so absolute that they had become the single greatest shield for an unrighteous cause. He was the hero whose merit was undeniable, but whose choices, bound by the ornum of a single act of kindness, led him to his doom. He remains the Danavira, the hero of charity, who gave away his invincibility, and the Sutaputra, who chose the dharma of loyalty over the dharma of blood, and in doing so, became the epic's most profound, most human, and most enduring tragedy.